speakers are starting to come in now live on YouTube.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome to our third annual Impact Symposium. My name is Bob Fiduccio, and I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for Vertigo Ventures, a team of international experts. For those unfamiliar, there'll be more information later in the day about us and exactly what we do. So with that, the theme of today's session, we move on to the next slide. The theme of today's session is adapting research culture to achieve the SDGs. We saw earlier in the year in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals report of 2022 that the world is some way off the mark, but this is just one of the many indicators of progress that is simply happening too slow. We also know that in order to achieve these goals, research has a critical role to play. So today we ask the questions of what we can do with research culture to help speed up our sustainability goals, and what impact has to do with this. To kick things off, I'd like to introduce Steve Kenzie of the UN Global Compact Network UK, which together with partners in the SDSN and academia more broadly, has presented its own report, Measuring Up 2.0, to look at how the UK is getting on when it comes to these reports. And with that, great to have you, Steve, and over to you.
Thank you, Bob. And let me just get my screen activated. And there we go. All right, thank you very much. And it's great to be with you today. First up, just to explain that I am the executive director of the UN Global Compact Network UK, and we're part of the UN Global Compact, which is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. Our focus is primarily on shifting business behavior, and to join a business CEO, a leadership commitment, is to commit to our 10 universal principles in the areas of human rights, labor, and anti-corruption. Companies need to report annually on the progress they're making towards doing that, and then also support the wider UN development agenda, which for the time being is best represented by the SDGs, which is what has brought us together today. As Bob mentioned, we just completed a fairly extensive look at the performance of the UK against the goals. A bit of history on this, you note Measuring Up 2.0. Measuring Up 1.0 was a project undertaken by an organization called the UK Stakeholders for Sustainable Development in 2018. And they organized a large group of stakeholders and it's pretty much established, I suppose, the methodology that we used. UKSSD was wound up a few years ago, but we've sort of absorbed their mission into ours. And so certainly this was a part of what we wanted to do. After the 2018 edition of Measuring Up, the government did its first and only voluntary national review, which was presented to the UN, presented at the UN at the high-level political forum in 2019. Not surprisingly, perhaps, it had a slightly more positive outlook than Measuring Up had done. Some contentious bits in there. One in particular was that there was a commitment to establish an effective mechanism to enhance stakeholder engagement around implementation of the SDGs and to enable the next VNR to be produced more efficiently and effectively. Of course, that remains wanting. Since 2019, obviously, a lot has happened. We had Brexit, well, we didn't have Brexit since 2019, but the changes are certainly starting to bite since then. Cost of living crisis, COVID, of course, now the Ukraine war. A lot of that stuff isn't reflected in the data yet, but nonetheless, we felt the time was right to once again revisit measuring up and take a pulse of just where the country was at. So we worked with over 100 organizations and individuals to measure domestic performance. There's another organization in the UK, Bond. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them, that did a similar exercise looking more at the UK's performance internationally. We assessed the performance on each target using the ONS SDG data website and a number of other sources. This was all collated into a report, which we launched on the 28th of September. And we certainly hope the findings will be useful. And of course, I'm duty bound to just plug our sponsors there that helped make this report a success. Our findings: we looked at 132 out of the 169 targets. These were the ones we considered to have a meaningful domestic component. We found that performance on 23 of the targets had improved, 18 had gotten worse, 65 had not changed. And I think for this audience in particular, it's noteworthy that there is a data gap where there were 10 of the targets that we would have liked to look at, but there was not appropriate data to support that research. So there may be an area of interest for this audience. Some of the things we found, getting worse, notably, almost 15% of the population experienced food insecurity. That's a fairly scary thought. And of course, the cost of living crisis just keeps getting worse. So there's certainly plenty of concern around goals 1, 2, 7, and 8. On a more positive side, food waste has dropped by 15%. So that's encouraging on SDG 12. A rarely expressed, especially by myself, I'll note, positive outcome from Brexit in the area of SDG 15 around sustainable agriculture, and the government has done some stuff in the right direction there. Great plans from the government around more sustainable infrastructure in Goal 9. And of course, we previously, in previous iterations of our national government, had seen really quite impressive commitments in the area of climate change and net zero. So let's hope that we're able to stick to those. Some things that haven't changed, and of course, having not changed isn't really something to celebrate when these are the items. Target 5.5 on gender equality, we still see women badly underrepresented in business and politics. Modern slavery continues to be a big issue, even with the passage of the Modern Slavery Act. It actually seems that the problem is actually worsening here in the UK. And we're having difficulty making real progress on improving water quality and water efficiency, protecting marine areas. Obviously, the news over the summer had lots to say about our issues around managing sewage. So just a snapshot. I would really urge everyone to have a look at the full report and get the greater detail. Some overarching comments, though. Clearly, the lack of a strong agenda from the national government means we're not addressing systemic issues holistically, and that means we're leaving people behind. And that's, fundamentally in opposition to what the SDGs are all about. So that's a real concern. What needs to happen? More planning from the government. We need a whole of government, whole of society approach to the SDGs. We need the think tanks and the researchers starting to produce policy ideas that are going to move us forward on this agenda. So I think, again, plenty of work there for the research community. We need leadership, and here particularly we're talking about the government leadership, the top, from the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Home Secretary, some spoken commitment around the goals. So the level of awareness is abysmal. We need more stakeholder engagement. Of course, we're asking the government to just fulfill the promises that they made after the 2019 VNR. And here again, I think plenty of scope for other stakeholders to engage. And we want to see another VNR just as soon as possible. We're thinking as soon as possible is now maybe 2024. Okay, so role of stakeholders. The report is got more than 50 case studies from civil society, business, and national and local governments, stuff that's working, that is having a positive impact. So we certainly encourage people to look there for inspiration. Business engagement around the goals has been excellent, although we need more support for small companies. Civil society organizations have a critical role to play, and we know there's a need for more reassurance that the government is serious about it, but maybe we just can't wait, and we need everybody to just start making more noise. It's estimated that only 1 in 10 adults in the UK are actually familiar in any way with the SDGs. With that low level of awareness, our work is cut out for us to try and move the needle. And then this is my last slide. There has been lots of momentum from the education sector in driving academic research, delivering education for sustainable development, equipping students with knowledge and skills, and institutions themselves taking a leading role. So I commend you all for that, but encourage you to double down and let's do more. Thanks very much. If you have time before it goes off the screen to grab that QR code, I'd be delighted to connect on LinkedIn. If you want to follow Global Compact or Global Compact Network, there's some details there. Thank you very much. And I hand it back now to Bob. Or no, I'm handing it over to Kate, I guess, sorry.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick up directly from there. So I'm Dr. Kate Roll. I'm an associate professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL, University College London. I'm a political scientist. And I'm also the chair of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, UK, which Anka, who will be speaking next, will tell you a lot more about. We also contributed to the Measuring Up report, so another set of connections here. I'm going to make some quite brief comments. Of course, I've forgotten to set my timer already, so here we go. I'm going to say a little bit about IIPP, the institute where I am, as potentially an example of the way that academia is engaging with the SDGs increasingly and what that looks like organizationally. I'll talk a little bit more broadly about the role of higher education and academia and the SDGs, and then I'm going to end on sort of two quick provocations. But I'll start just by mentioning a little bit about my institute and just sharing a little bit about who we are. So I'll share slides and then make that, there we go. So this is sort of our modus, our MO, our reason to, reason for being. We're led by the economist Mariana Mazzucato, who's gained a lot of attention for her work on rethinking the state, the role of the state in driving innovation, as well as the role of the state in facilitating things like green transitions or work around inequality. And she's really become well known, and the Institute has become well known for an idea called missions and mission-oriented innovation, which is a way of rethinking the purpose of public sector work from around, or even something like industrial strategy, from around saying, let's have a strong automotive industry, to saying, what's the purpose of that sector? What are we trying to do here? Are we trying to make transportation accessible and clean? What's the reason that we care about a sector, rather than just saying the sector should grow in and of itself? So setting a mission, which then brings together different parts of the economy, different actors to pursue it. And I'll tie that back to SDGs in a moment. And the thing that really brought me to IIPP was this idea, which we have on our tote bags, we have on our pencil cases, innovation is political. Again, as someone who was teaching on innovation strategy, very interested in these questions, but also a political scientist, this was something that I was bringing together in my work and in my teaching, but felt like I sort of didn't have a home. And so IAPP, this is what they're about. Innovation is political. And this idea that innovation and innovation policies have an impact on all of us, on our lives, on the direction of our economy is very important. It's political in that way. We're all interested in these processes, but also it's political in the sense that it's negotiated, that stakeholders have a role in setting that direction, and that these are decisions that are made. They're not natural outcomes of markets. So this is being sort of a really key idea for us. And I mentioned, let me just close that screen. I mentioned this idea of missions. And if you saw on that first slide, this idea of challenges or missions, and that's one of sort of the first ways that we think about or engage with the SDGs, is the SDGs are this incredibly important set of highly legitimate and widely recognized goals that we can say, well, there's been broad consensus around clean oceans or reducing plastics. How can we build missions around these? So the SDGs are very much incorporated into some of our work and the work that we do with partners. The other thing to say is that a lot of the work that we do at IAPP, the Institute for Innovation Public Purpose, is impact-driven research. So we've done projects on cities, on industrial strategy. I led a multi-year initiative on taxation in the SDGs, working with a Spanish partner. And we really are oriented around impact-driven research, working with partners, making sure things don't only just sit in a drawer, but that we can trace the academic research into practice or into seeding ideas, what the scholar Kingdon calls the policy soup, the ideas that are out there that maybe down the line get picked up and put into practice. And I think comparing this with more traditional departments that I've been part of in the past, I think we have a strong emphasis on communications. We have a strong emphasis on communications and storytelling, which is, I think, important and sort of emerging practice in higher education. We have a really strong interest in multidisciplinarity. So we're a multidisciplinary department, which you're seeing more and more new departments are bringing together people. We've got philosophers, sociologists, public administration scholars, economists, political scientists, all working together. And then also this focus or this balance between real world impact or policy impact and more traditional metrics around publication. And I think when we talk about the role of universities or when we talk about research culture, all of those things are part of that mix, are part of that changeover, if we're going to talk about adaptation within higher education and within research culture. If we think again about, the way SDGs or the way we enact SDGs in research culture, we're looking for effects on who is doing the research, who's involved, what are the subjects, and how it's communicated. So those are all become really important, and initiatives that bring together scholars, that bring together activists like Measuring Up, for me, are a really nice artifact of some of that change, some of that adaptation with research culture, where people are interested in investing time and skills into producing these kind of reports that are impact focused and SDG aligned. As part of SDSN, we do see some of the challenges that universities are facing at incorporating the SDGs into their practices, whether it's their policies around travel or food and catering, or if it's around their curriculum, or if it's about their education, their research programs. And a lot of the discussions that we have across universities are around issues of visibility, governance, buy-in, awareness, these same issues that universities across the UK are all currently working on at different stages, of course, but we're all kind of asking the same questions and trying to solve the same problems. And so this issue of visibility is a very core one. Do we know what research we're doing? Do we know who's working on the SDGs? And particularly, do those who are working on key issues know that their work is SDG aligned? So there's a communication piece there, there's a mapping piece there that we see very commonly across universities, where they say, we're doing more on the SDGs than we think or than we report. And so a lot of it is capturing that activity that's actually already happening. As I mentioned, the second probably big bucket of activity or questions that you see in universities are around this idea of governance. How do we drive this agenda? How do we do this reporting? How do we deal with things like rankings? And different universities are solving this in different ways. But these are big, highly decentralized, often entities. And so this question of how do you bring this together? How do you organize people around the SDGs has been really challenging, and one that I'm actually interested in sort of potentially doing some research around to get a better sense of how that's being solved across higher education in the UK. But I do think we are seeing high level of buy-in, much greater awareness. And I think that's part of a shift in higher education, where there's been more and more interest in real world impact and away from just only looking at things like journal publication. And this is a really important shift for higher ed more generally, but in the UK as well, because it's tied to our purpose for being, our license to operate, all of these issues, our legitimacy as institutions. So now I'll just close with two sort of short provocations. I think that there's a very important role, and this is the one that's mainly discussed, in the UK higher education sector as researchers, creating evidence, doing evaluation, understanding how we can advance the SDGs. And I think that's incredibly important. I think there's also a role for critical engagement with the SDGs. I sometimes give a talk where I say, these aren't the 17 commandments that were handed down to us. These are a product of politics, of negotiation. They're imperfect. And so there's a really interesting role for academia in understanding the SDGs as a tool and its strengths and its weaknesses. And, despite the amount of work that's aligned with SDGs, there's actually quite a big gap in terms of research about the SDGs and how they're used, how they're appropriated or misappropriated in different agendas, how localization works, and even again around their formation. So, there's a real opportunity for academia to be a critical friend around the SDGs and help us understand better the mechanisms that are working or not working in terms of advancing these agendas, as well as who's setting the agenda in the first place. And then my sort of second or closing provocation is, going back to that idea that academia is, we're doing lots of research that's highly relevant to the SDGs, that's highly relevant to our own backyard. And there becomes a question of, is this a supply or demand problem potentially? A lot of focus has been about saying, are you producing relevant research? But when I talk to people within my faculty, they're saying, yes, we're producing a lot of work on the built environment or on green transitions, for example. But we're seeing in the wake of austerity, the absorptive capacity on the government side, their ability to work with academia, to take in research, to experiment with new ideas has been severely curtailed. So we need to be thinking about this not only on the production of good and relevant research, but also on whether or not we have partners both within the private and the public sector that are in a position to help take on this research and put it into practice. So we really need to be thinking about both sides of those equations, of that equation. So I think I'll close there. I'm very happy to talk more about SDSN, which of course Anka will speak about next, as well as the role of academia, of research, and the way we think about partnerships. But it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Okay, I'll jump straight in then. I will just share my slides. Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Anka Taku, and I'm the Network Manager for the newly formed UK Hub for the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, as Kate has already mentioned. So alongside my colleague, Dr. Kate Roll, I have led the development of the UK Hub for SDSN. I'm based at UCLI IPP, and we are acting as the host institution for SDSN UK. So for the next few minutes, I will just give you a bit of an overview about what SDSN is, some of the project and activities we've already led on, also what might come next, and how this fits into the work that Steve and Kate have already alluded to. So the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network is a global network of universities, research centers, and other knowledge institutions. It was established in 2012 under the auspices of the UN Secretary General. And it's the only UN mandated network of universities which mobilizes the academic community to translate expertise into action to advance the SDGs. Sorry, just a second. Okay. SDSN works closely with UN agencies, with multilateral financing institutions, the private sector, and civil society. And as it stands, it has over 1,700 members that are grouped in 50 networks across 137 countries. Okay. So much of SDSN's work is often led by sort of national or regional networks that bring together local knowledge institutions around practical solutions to promote and contribute to the advancement of the SDGs, which is also very much in line with their unique local contexts and challenges. So for example, networks such as SDSN Germany, SDSN Spain, or SDSN Northern Europe, they've already been in this space for a while and they're well established. So until recently, a number of UK universities were already members of the global SDSN. However, they hadn't been sort of coalesced around the UK hub. So UCLI IPP, we were invited to host the UK hub for SDSN. And as Kate has already mentioned, the Institute is very well placed to lead this important effort, as its existing portfolio of work addresses how public value is reimagined to tackle the societal challenges that the SDGs embody. So we had a soft launch event back in June 2021, and we then had an official launch that took place in January 2022, so it's still fairly new. The University of Strathclyde is hosting a sub-network for the Scottish universities, and this is currently being developed. And as it stands, SDSN UK has 20 confirmed member institutions and several others who are at the application stage. You can see the list of all members here, but it includes universities such as Imperial College, the Grantham Institute at LSE, University of Manchester, Newcastle University. So we have quite a good regional spread as well. In terms of the SDSN UK work, we can say it can roughly be split into sort of three key pillars of activity. The research, obviously, we want to advance research and interdisciplinary collaborations as a primary vehicle to address the challenges of sustainable development. So within its research activities, the network has particularly focused on sharing and facilitating opportunities for interdisciplinary collaborations at this stage. On the education side, we want to promote a high quality education agenda for the Agenda 2030. So we want to focus on mobilizing network members to create educational outputs, such as developing resources to support teaching the SDGs across different subjects. And of course, policy engagement. We want to actively contribute to policy debates around the implementation of the SDGs in the UK political agenda. As Steve has said, there's still a lot of work to be done in that space. And we want to provide that common voice for UK higher education institutions and a platform for them to effectively engage with stakeholders in the UK SDG policy ecosystem. So as I said, our official launch was at the end of January this year. So we're still new, but we have already embarked on a few key projects. One of them is, of course, collaborating with UN Global Compact Network UK to produce the Measuring Up 2.0 report, which assesses the UK's performance against the SDGs. As Steve mentioned, this follows the 2018 Measuring Up report that informed the UK government's first and only so far voluntary national review of progress towards the SDGs. So SDSN UK facilitated collaboration on the report between the network members, UCLI IPP, Newcastle University, and University of Strathclyde. We worked on the initial data discovery and collection, and we authored a number of chapters in the report. In July, we also organized the SDSN UK Times Higher Education Impact Rankings event, where Laura Tucker, the CEO of Vertigo Ventures, and Duncan Ross, the Chief Data Officer for Times Higher Education, joined our panel. This event provided an opportunity for our university member institutions to reflect on how the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings can enable universities to assess their impact against the UN SDGs. And one outcome from the event was the formation of a working group that explores whether and how greater coordination around the practicalities of reporting against the Times Higher Impact Rankings criteria could be achieved. So in terms of what's next, we will, of course, continue to grow our community, to share research opportunities for interdisciplinary collaborations. We want to organize events and engage with stakeholders in the UK SDG policy ecosystem. In terms of more specific project ideas, this includes, so as a result actually of our work on the Measuring Up 2.0 report, we are planning to embark on a joint impact-oriented research project, which aims to improve the collection and availability of UK government data for the SDGs, which is currently reported by the Office for National Statistics. Again, as Steve mentioned, there were quite a lot of data gaps that were identified in the report, so this work will build directly on one of the chapters in the report that was authored by SDSN UK members, UCLI IPP, and Newcastle University. We are also exploring a joint research project that looks at the most effective internal structures to embed the SDGs within UK universities. Again, as Kate mentioned, this is a challenge that we keep sort of hearing from our members. So, it's still in its early stages, but we expect that it will aim to explore how and if more of the research and operations within UK universities can be framed around the SDGs. And we're also looking at creating case studies or other types of teaching materials that speak to the values of education for sustainable development that could be applied in any discipline. And we hope this will have very broad applications. So just some final thoughts. I'd say our network's overall goal is to enable the fruits of academic research to be translated and applied in the real world by policymakers, but also by higher education institutions themselves to produce solutions that lead to achieving the SDGs. So if your institution is interested in learning more about SDSN UK or joining, we encourage you to contact us. Thank you very much for your time.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. I think we have a few minutes now just for a few questions. So please fire some more questions in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll hopefully get to addressing them now. But just to begin with, I have a question for Steve, based on the report. Are specific industries or sectors doing better than others, like, noticeably, with regards to their progress towards the UN SDGs?
Since you've given me the out of saying noticeably, I'm going to say no. I think there are outstanding examples in just about every sector of companies that have really taken this agenda on board and have internalized many of the goals, recognizing the value in having an objective external reference point upon which to guide their sustainability programs, and that the SDGs provide that role really effectively. And so we are seeing companies internalizing some of the targets, but no, I wouldn't say there was any particular sector that was better than any others. They've all got unique challenges.
Brilliant. No, that's really interesting. Thank you. I've got a question for Kate as well. You mentioned a really interesting point on whether universities and individuals actually know whether or not they're contributing towards the UN SDGs. Do you have any suggestions or advice with regards to how that could potentially be addressed?
Yeah, it's maybe sort of the corollary to the 1 in 10 adults statistic, recognizing the SDGs. I think a lot of academics are very sort of keen and focused on their work and haven't really thought about its relationship to the SDGs as a global framework. I think that's one of the arguments or one of the roles of having coordinating groups within universities that help people recognize and link their work with the SDGs. I think it's also a really nice way for researchers to think about the impact of their work and the relevance of their work. So I think it's a real benefit for there to be either champions within departments or within faculties, or high visibility of the SDGs and its agenda within universities. Say, hey, you think you're working on this tiny little problem, or you're working on basic research, but actually, I mean, basic in the technical sense, not simple research, but and it absolutely contributes to these big, current and important issues that we're all caring about and that are part of a global agenda. So I think, advocates, having people having these conversations, going to departments, talking about the SDGs, I think that's all really important work that you're increasingly seeing universities do. And also is something that, by participating in things like impact rankings or impact assessments, they're increasingly going out to different departments, to different faculties, and really capturing these stories of impact and important SDG aligned research, and sort of saying, hey, you think you're doing this, but actually you're also contributing to this global agenda.
Perfect, thank you. I can just see a couple of questions coming in the chat. So the first one I'm going to come to is from John Milan. I'm just going to read it aloud. So, a question on time frame. 2030 is increasingly looking to be a fairly short time horizon. Are either of your organizations looking beyond 2030 to the SDG type landscape that will steer global consensus thereafter? Any comments? Welcome, thanks. Did anyone want to specifically address that?
I'm also happy to come in on it. Yeah.
Great. I'll go to you first, Steve, and then to you, Kate.
Just really briefly, we're not, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it? We start talking about after the SDGs, we're effectively conceding we're not going to achieve the SDGs, and not many people want to go there just yet. Although realistically, we really need to step up, but that's what we're asking for now. Let's step up and achieve them by 2030. But those conversations have begun. I know they're happening in the UN, and they're happening privately as others are jockeying for position. And we saw this after the MDGs, and it started at around the same time where the jockeying for position as to what would follow. So it's happening. We're not really leading the charge on that. We're still sticking to driving for more ambition around the SDGs, but the conversations are happening.
Yeah, Anka and I were actually on a call this morning talking about this very issue, which is why I jumped. And this double-edged problem came up, and that was front and center. And I think our colleague was very skeptical about this. And I think maybe SDSN UK is more interested in this conversation, particularly from sort of the academic angle. And we've been approached by a government partner to potentially facilitate a conversation on the post-2030 agenda. I think there's a big motivation around, who's going to be around the table, who's going to be part of this, not wanting to get left out. I think that's very present in terms of the politics of this. But I actually think there's maybe a more interesting sort of thought experiment, big picture, ambitious question about understanding what's been, really worked well about the SDGs and where have the limitations been. So again, the sort of critical friend role to say, a lot of scholarship has looked at localization. A lot of scholarship has looked at interaction, both positive and negative, across SDGs. There's other ways of measuring. There's other indices like I see well-being in the chat, but happiness index, what's missing? We don't have language and culture. We don't have LGBTQI issues in the SDGs. Are there gaps that need to be filled? And so there's some really interesting conversations to be had where when you've got a long runway, you can do some of this big blue sky thinking that I think when it gets closer to the time gets much more difficult. So I think SDSN UK is quite interested in helping to lead potentially a series of conversations, coming at this from really diverse and maybe, out there perspectives to see if we can generate some new thinking, because I don't really want to end up in a kind of a path dependency that leads from, MDGs to SDGs to now we have 25 next, and it's sort of a continuation of what we see each time. What would be a pivot that makes these more effective and more fit for purpose? But I agree, there's a huge risk to jumping 15 years in the future and throwing the current ones under the bus. So it needs to be how do we continue what's been really good about these, and how do we think in creative and proactive ways about what could come after? But yeah, it's starting. It is absolutely starting.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I realise we have just run out of time, so we have got more questions. So I'll just make a point that we will absolutely address all of the questions that are posted, so keep them coming in, and we'll hopefully either have time at the end or we'll send in a follow-up. But otherwise, I can hand back to Bob. Thank you all so much.
Okay, thank you, Andy. And thanks very much, Steve, Kate and Anka, for sharing these insights with us. Having faced that reality check around the SDGs, it's time now to look at some ideas for how we can address these. Our first panel of the day looks at embedding impact and the Sustainable Development Goal alignment into research culture. And we're delighted to welcome back Dr. Stephen Hill, Director of Research within Research England, who is joined this year by Dr. Simon Kerridge of Kerridge Research Consulting, and Dr. Saskia Pagela, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Pagela, apologies if I haven't, who is the head of IRIS at Bangor University. I'll now hand back to Andy.
Brilliant, thanks, Bob. It's great to have you back, Stephen, and thank you both, Simon and Saskia, for joining us. So we've now seen the situation around SDG progress in the UK. I'd like to welcome our guests and open up the floor for discussion around the role that research, and particularly research culture, can play in helping turn this around. First off, if I could just ask the panel to briefly introduce themselves. So if Stephen, I could start with you, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Stephen Hill. I'm Director of Research at Research England within UK Research and Innovation. And I guess my interest is very much in research impact and how we can measure research impact and incentivize researchers to focus on impact, which I think is very directly relevant to the topic that we're discussing today around the Sustainable Development Goals. So looking forward to the discussion.
Brilliant, thanks, Stephen. Simon, if I could come to you next, please.
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry for being blank screen before. I had my modesty filter on. So yeah, I'm Simon Kerridge, sort of an independent consultant now, but I was previously head of research services at the University of Kent, and before that, the University of Sunderland. So I've sort of done north and south in England, if you like. I'm very much research management and administration, so that's kind of my focus of things. So I guess what I'll be bringing to the conversation is thinking about processes to support how research happens, probably thinking about collaborative research, north-south partnerships, and ideally south-north partnerships, or even south-south-north partnerships, trying to make things work better. I was also very interested about the sort of things that Kate was talking about in terms of, well, are we doing anything to support Sustainable Development Goals, and how do we know? And thinking about the use of metadata, or the very bad use of metadata at the moment, for example, in publications, or indeed REF case studies. If you look for SDG in the REF case studies, it's about 1.4% of them mention SDG. I suspect more than 1.4% of them have an impact on SDG targets. So yeah, interesting issues.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Simon. And Saskia, if I can come to you, please.
Thank you. Yes, my name's Saskia. I work at Bangor University. So I've had a sort of interesting career around the impact agenda, starting more through a funded project by Welsh Government, a large consortium between the 4 largest Welsh universities, bringing together all climate change related research. And we had a big budget around engagement with different sectors in society, and really to increase that interdisciplinary working in the field of climate change. But as I say, a big budget around policy engagement and communicating the evidence base. So it's really at the start of that, of impact being a term within the agenda, and then the pathways to impact plans came in within the UKRI proposals. Subsequently moved into managing impact for the university. So like you, I'm more in an administrative role, tracking, helping the researchers to understand impact, and then generate, track, and putting together the REF submission for Bangor.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, everyone. And my name's Andy. I'm the head of engagement here at VV, and I'll just be moderating this session and sort of directing some questions. So please fire questions throughout, and hopefully we'll have time to address them. But just to sort of kick things off to the panel, so Global Compact's Measuring Up 2.0 report highlighted that out of the 132 targets, with regards to the UK's delivery of the SDGs, only 17% are on track. What are your generic thoughts on this and possible reasons for this? If anyone wanted to go first.
Well, I don't mind going first.
Yep, fire away, Stephen.
So I guess, obviously, my reaction as a citizen is that I'm disappointed in the content of the report. That's goes without saying, really, that if you believe the Sustainable Development Goals have some good about them, good related to them, then we ought to be doing better than that. As a professional in research policy, then I guess my reaction is that I don't really understand enough to know whether that poor performance is related to a lack of research or a gap in knowledge and transmission of knowledge to policymakers. It might just as much be related to policy and, dare I say, politics around some of those goals as it is to research. So I think, as I say, as a citizen, I find it disappointing. As a research policy professional, I think it just raises lots of questions for me about whether we're doing the right research and sufficient research. But I don't, I think we really struggle to know whether what the answer to that question is, which I think is linked to what Kate said in her earlier comments. And I do think that we have a kind of really significant measurement problem around the SDGs and research, which I'm happy to say more about later in the panel. But I think that goes to the heart of some of the challenges we face.
Brilliant, Saskia. I could see you nodding along. Did you have anything to add on that?
I do think there's an issue around how we measure the impact of our research. I mean, I think it's improving, but I think the drive to measure it is not always driven by the right factors. So, we obviously want to do well in the ref, but that doesn't mean we're capturing and measuring all the impact that research is having. So there's an awful lot lost if it doesn't fit, or we've reached our maximum requirement within the ref 3 submission. So I think that's a big driver around research impact culture. It's both an enabler in terms of understanding the impact, but it's also a limitation. Because it's a resource-heavy situation. But I also think there's an issue, obviously, with the political landscape at the moment, and we're feeling it very much in North Wales with the loss of things like structural funds, which are big drivers of that sort of immediate, things like community regeneration, delivery from research engagement. So I think the political landscape is definitely playing a part in the situation.
Yeah, and if I can just sort of throw into the mix, I'm trying to think how long ago now, 5 years ago now, I think the big impetus, the promise of funding to support Sustainable Development Goals, which of course was kind of axed halfway through. And I think there was a lot of great stuff that started off then. And when something like that happens and then funding is then sort of pulled and diverted, projects stopped, things don't happen, it really turns people off. And that was almost worse than not having had it in the first place. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is, if we really want to sort these out, then we need funding directed towards doing that. It's a moonshot that's needed.
Yeah, brilliant. No, thank you all for weighing in on that. I'll touch on the measurement of the SDGs a bit later on, if that's okay. But more broadly, what role do you think that UK research plays in actually achieving the SDGs? And that's not just in a UK context, that's in a global context. Anyone want to weigh in on that first?
Well, I will go first. I think research plays a critical role, and we've seen that for, leading on from your point around funding, where funding enables those partnerships, and in fact is dependent on them at the funding proposal stage, and think of things like GCRF and those pots of money where at the proposal stage you have to assure the reviewers of tangible impacts at that stage that are going to come from the research. You're more likely to have delivery around the SDGs if that's set out in the proposals. I mean, I think research and development is still there, but I think that, there are issues around the difficulties in delivering research of that nature, which we haven't ironed out, and particularly for it to be transformational. So there's a danger that the change and delivery on the goals could be quite incremental and not transformational. And I think we've definitely seen that around some of the research in this domain.
Yeah, and I guess if I just throw in the point which I started with, which was about collaboration and support for research, I think there's been a lot of funding, I'll just take Africa as an example, gone into developing research in Africa, but most of that funding has been directed towards undertaking research and not providing that research infrastructure. So when a UK university has a partnership with an African university, it tends to be quite one-sided and problematic, and therefore the research that happens isn't the best research which could take place. So I feel that the world as a whole is losing something. And I suppose the situation doesn't get any better, because an African institution might have a very low indirect cost rate, overhead rate, because they don't have institutional research office. So when they get funded, they get that overhead rate, and they can't invest to get it. Whereas a UK university already has that, and it's part of their overhead, and they do get funded for that. So there are all sorts of inequalities there, which I think are contributing to us not achieving the goals as quickly as we might do.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with either Saskia or Simon in their answer. I think, clearly there is very strong evidence that research has an important role to play in achieving, societal challenges in general, and the SDGs in particular. And Simon mentioned that the REF case studies, kind of, if you do a search for sustainable development goals, you don't get many hits. But if you just browse through those case studies, you find lots and lots of research and impact that's relevant for the SDGs. I think what's interesting in the context of the presentation that we just heard about the UK's performance is whether in our research system, researchers really think about the SDGs in the context of the UK. I think there tends to be a focus when we talk about the SDGs of the developing world rather than the UK. And I think the report that's been presented to us this afternoon is a real kind of potentially wake-up call for researchers to actually start thinking about how their research can have an impact on those SDGs in a UK context, as well as or instead of in a global context. And I just, this is anecdotal. I got no evidence to support what I'm about to say, but I just don't think UK researchers would necessarily be thinking about the SDGs in the context of the UK. So I think there's a communication issue there.
I totally agree to that. I would just add, I made the point earlier, and I wondered if I couldn't see it within the report when I did a search for the term, but the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in 2015 passed by Welsh Government obviously is very much linked to the same goals. It's a smaller number of goals, but shared principles with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I couldn't see whether that is having any difference at a regional scale or not, but whether it's offset by different issues, like I said, about loss of structural funds impacting that UK R&D in the sorts of locations like Wales.
Simon, I can see you've just said totally agree. Stephen, did you have anything to add on this?
Other than I couldn't find the unmute button. No, I totally agree. And again, it's anecdotal as well, but certainly when you're speaking to academics, or when I'm speaking to academics about sustainable development goals, the fact that it might be impacting somewhere in Kent is not going to be top of their list of thought processes.
Great, thank you. So moving on to the measurement of impact, I guess. Do you think there is a more suitable framework for measuring impact other than the SDGs? Simon, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, that's because I had nothing to say. I think measuring is quite a divisive word. Anyway, with my ref panel advisor hat on, I think assessing would be the way to go. Measuring, I think, is always very difficult. I think it is a very useful tool, but it's not the only tool. And that's, I have no magic answer.
Yeah.
My thought, oh, go on.
No.
I was just going to say, I think there's a conflict here in relation to the earlier question around ref impact case studies and the metrics of reach and significance. So if you're talking about problems that are globally relevant, such as the SDGs, you're going to be looking for that focus across the globe, and maybe that means we lose. Maybe that's part of this issue in this report, is we're not focusing close to home because it doesn't give you that sort of reach and significance around these grand challenges. So that in a way, the frameworks may be playing off against each other from the local to the global scale with the different metrics.
Yeah, and I think one, going on your question about are the SDGs the right framework, in the context of the ref impact, we regularly get asked this question about should we put more structure into the way in which we assess ref impact? Should we actually be defining categories of impact and requiring people to report against specific categories? And if you go globally, look at research assessment in Italy, that's exactly what they do. They have 10 areas of impact, and their impact reporting has to fit into one of those 10 areas. And if you think about, if you were going to build a framework like that for the UK ref, then maybe the SDGs would be a good starting point to do that. They're pretty comprehensive. But as I think Kate mentioned in her presentation earlier, they're not, there's not everything. Not all research impact is captured within the SDGs, so there wouldn't be a perfect framework for doing that, and there would be a risk if you chose that framework that some other things got left out, and that's the reason why we've never in the 2 iterations of impact in the ref chosen to have a framework within which we expect people to work, because we don't want to. Any framework has the risk of excluding impact and narrowing the way in which people think about impact. And we know that's a challenge in the ref context anyway, that Saskia's already mentioned, that simply the ref itself has a tendency to cause people to privilege certain types of impact over others. I think when I alluded earlier to the measurement problem, I think I was also thinking not in a ref context, but about the way in which we talk about research and the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think there is a tendency, it's become a very prominent idea that we need to link research to the Sustainable Development Goals, but that tends to happen, or has tended to happen, by people trying to map conventional academic research outputs onto the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's the way the Times Higher ranking that was mentioned earlier works in the research space. It takes a mapping that Elsevier have produced in their Scopus database of publications, journal articles against the SDGs. But there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that those mappings, and there are others in addition to the Elsevier one, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest those mappings are far from perfect. The Elsevier mapping and the dimensions mapping and other mappings don't give you the same sets of publications for the same SDGs. So there's clearly, which one of them's correct? Are any of them correct? But also just the emphasis on the publications is itself problematic, because I think just because a researcher is doing some work that is publishable and relevant to an SDG tells us absolutely nothing about whether that work is really making a difference to that SDG on the ground. So that's what I meant by, we have a measurement problem. We just don't have a way of connecting research activity to the SDGs, in my view.
Saskia, Simon, I could see you nodding. Did you have anything to add on that?
I just wonder also, dare I venture into the problems with the goals themselves? There are, with any framework, there's going to be limitations. But if you take, say, goal 8 around economic growth, that is directly conflicting with other goals around life below water, because we know with a growth sort of paradigm, then we're looking at limited resources and exploitation of them, and so within the framework itself, you've got potentially goals offsetting each other. So you may grow, you may be delivering on one, and actually, if you chose to measure it, harming another. So I think there's problems there.
Do you think there's an argument for those to be removed then, the ones that do contradict each other in that sense?
I think it's system science, isn't it? It's so complex. I mean, I'm not sure it's achievable. I guess a prioritization model.
Sure.
Yeah, it all comes down to who does the prioritization then, though, doesn't it? So I think they are in conflict or in tension with each other. Some of them in sort of bilateral or triangles or whatever. But I think we just have to live with that and do the best that we can. I mean, if we're not going to achieve all of the goals by 2030, or probably even by 2040, I wonder if this has been recorded. If we can make progress towards them, then I think that in itself is good enough in terms of a target. And just say I posted a link for a paper written by Phil Purnell about the sort of thing that Stephen was talking about in terms of taking the keywords searches for papers to determine the number. This is looking specifically at climate change, of number of publications looking at climate change. So it's quite a nice critique in there.
It's an interesting point, Simon, on the time frame for achieving the SDGs. And although no one wants to commit to any such time frame, do you think having a time frame that pretty much we're all under the impression that is not going to be achieved by, say, 2030, do you think that helps or hinders progress?
I think the problem is if you change it to 2040 or 2050, it's foot off the pedal, isn't it? So I don't know. I'm not a social scientist.
Good answer. Okay, let's move on to research culture in particular. To what extent do you think impact or even understanding of SDGs is embedded into UK research culture? Again, that's a question to the floor.
Oh, goodness me. Nature holds a vacuum and Simon abhors silence. Yeah, it really depends. I mean, we heard some really great examples from Kate earlier in terms of individual units who are really engaged. If you go across, again, take Kent as an example. If I went across the various divisions now at Kent, then in each division there will be some people who would be really engaged, understand, and think that it is part of their mission. There'll be a lot in the middle, and there'll be some who are like the 9 in 10 members of the public, or SDGs. What are they? And I think that we're on a journey. As Saskia mentioned, the sort of GCRF funding, that really helped a lot in terms of raising that internal sort of awareness and importance of the SDGs, and yes, funding involved in it and funding associated with it. And so that's really important. In terms of that research culture part, then that's really down to each individual institution as to how they reward and how they prioritize and how they allow academics to do the sort of research that they want to do, or how they direct it towards things which perhaps the institution feels are important. You take an institute which is focused on climate change, for example, and their raison d'etre is research into climate change, how to reduce it, how to understand it. And so they'll dialed in directly to SDG 13 and some others as well. An institution as a whole, a university, which covers any number of subject areas, it's going to be more problematic. But it really is down to the leadership in the institution to reward in some way. So I guess I'll probably steal the phrase from the Netherlands, so recognition and reward for people doing what are perceived to be good things. So there's a lot of work going on in the UK on research culture at the moment, and I think we are on a journey, but not halfway over the bridge. But Stephen can now tell me something different.
There's a challenge. I think I'd probably broaden the question out and say that it's a question about impact culture in general, and how do we foster the right culture for delivering the maximum benefit from the research that we support. And that culture goes right through from how researchers select questions and research projects and topics to work on, right through to the work that they might do to take that research out into the broader world and allow it to achieve impact. And I think I'd be interested in Saskia's thoughts on this, but my sense is that over the period that Saskia talked about in her introductory remarks, as we've developed this notion of impact in UK higher education research, that we have moved in a hugely positive direction around both people's commitment to impact, their understanding of impact and how to deliver it and so on. So I think we've made huge strides forward. That's not to say that there isn't more to be done in the impact culture space. I think Mark Reed has written a really interesting book on this topic and an accompanying journal article. I'll stick links in the chat when I finish speaking. Where he makes the quite passionate case that this should really be about empowering academic researchers to find their own path towards the impact that they want to generate. I think there's a bit of a contrasting view where you might say that this is more about top-down support and providing the infrastructure and funding and associated structures for researchers to deliver impact. Maybe the right answer is some sort of combination between the two, fostering that bottom-up authentic culture of impact, if you want to use that word, and also putting in place the structures and the incentives that support impact. So I think everything I've just said about impact culture, I think you could just cross out the word impact and talk about SDGs in the same context. But as I say, I'm interested in Saskia's thoughts as someone directly involved in this in the university.
Thanks, Stephen. I agree with you. I think it's far more embedded. We released our strategy 2030, having previously had a research and an impact strategy back in 2010, and it's fully integrated now, following the same argument of UKRI when they removed the Pathways to Impact plan, that researchers know that they can just build that into their case for support. I would argue it's I can go from one point in the university to another and it'll be quite different, both the understanding of impact, the feeling that impact's their problem or their concern, whereas you've got researchers who've been motivated by delivering change in society from the start of their careers. So again, our earlier presenters saying this, and maybe there's some disciplines that are just naturally lent to delivering impact more than others, or whether it's basic research or applied, that sort of trajectory. But I would say the impact culture is much richer. There's much more engagement across disciplines, and that's being helped by the funding bodies, resourcing us to do that sort of thing. But I would also add that it's incredibly time and resource heavy for the researchers, and they're sort of dealing in a highly bureaucratic, administrative heavy sort of situations now. And I think we need to look to ways to make this easier for them, and the engagement with their potential beneficiaries as early on in the research process as possible, because that will guarantee the impacts more. So I think there's work to be done. And I also see a tendency for researchers to only think about ref impact. And we're going to do an impact culture assessment in 2023 to try and really pull that away and wider and see impact, as a wider piece of work than just an impact case study.
Sure. Just on that then, with regards to ref, what are your thoughts on how impact features within the submission? And I guess, Saskia, if I could go to you first.
Well, on the whole, I think it's very positive. It's a positive addition to the assessment framework. I think researchers, they don't like working on the impact case studies and this sort of laborious iterative process, but I think they like the end product. Certainly we liked our result this year in Bangor, particularly in some units of assessment. But no, I think it's a good addition, and I think it addresses the metrics which are attached to the outputs in REF, which tend to be more easily 4-star from the fundamental research end of the spectrum. And this gives those more applied researchers more visibility. So I would say it's here to stay. If the REF's here to stay, I would say the impact REF3 component will stick around.
Great, thank you. Anything to add on that, Simon or Stephen?
No, except to say that I think, obviously, not giving away anything about the future REF because those decisions haven't been made yet. But I think the impact element is one of, is one that on some levels works really well. So I think I'm agreeing with Saskia that it's there to stay. It is the case, though, that we're aware of the challenges that are associated with it, which Saskia has already mentioned, around the kind of the effect it has on people focusing on the types of impact that make good case studies and make for good REF assessment. And so I think, one of the things we're thinking about is what can we do to counter some of those pressures, or should we do anything to counter some of those pressures? But yeah, I think overall, my view, and I guess I would say this, wouldn't I, is that having impact in the national research evaluation is a net positive in terms of the delivery of impact from research across the nation.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just agree with that. And of course, we added in impact in order not to get a funding cut. So that was a great move. But yeah, no, it is really positive. I mean, I can't let it go by without mentioning the impact case study cliff edge in terms of one extra impact case study needed for an additional member of staff, and somehow that member of staff wasn't there. So there are, whenever you try and do any sort of assessment, there are people playing at the edges. So there's that issue. There's also, for me, the real issue of, you've got a small submission of 3 people, you still need 2 impact case studies, which was the same as what you needed for 19. So I mean, these are sort of minutiae. Impact in general, great, but we can probably do something a little bit better.
Great. No, thanks for that, everyone. So what about your expectations for impact and the SDGs in the context of research over the next 10 years or so? What are your thoughts on the direction it's moving in, where it's come from over the last 10 years, and how possibly if it's going to change or not at all over the coming years, again, in the context of research? Does anyone have any thoughts or comments on that?
I talk from a Bangor perspective. So central to our strategy is to really embed ourselves as a global centre of excellence in sustainability. So post-REF, we are one of the ones where if you did a search on our impact case studies, you wouldn't probably get any mention of the SDGs, but we have subsequently started doing analysis on them, both those and the Wellbeing Future Generations Act goals, and can really see, huge coverage across our submission. And on that note, it was in one of the earlier presentations, we're looking to understand which modules deliver on sustainable development goals. So all of the lecturers and staff, whether they're TNS or TNR, so teaching scholarship and research, are being motivated to consider SDGs within both their teaching and research context. So from a Bangor perspective, really on board and engaged with this.
And Simon, or Stephen? I can see Stephen. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think impact, continuing to facilitate impact from research will continue to be important for the next 10 years. And obviously around the SDGs, there's an increasing sense of urgency around delivery of those SDGs. But I'd come back to the points that were made earlier, that there's a supply and demand question. Maybe that there is already enough research on some of the topics in the SDGs to provide enough information to allow those goals to be reached. And what's holding us back is not the availability of knowledge, but is the practicalities of putting that knowledge in, practicalities in politics of putting that knowledge into practice. So I think we need to keep focusing research on delivering benefits, including those that are relevant to the SDGs. But at the same time, we also need to be thinking about the ways, that accepting of the fact that that isn't always the answer to bringing about change, that change needs to come from other directions. And one of the challenges in this space, and again, I think Kate also mentioned this earlier in her remarks, is this kind of question of absorptive capacity of policymakers to absorb the evidence that's available from academia. Something we've been Research England, we've funded a couple of projects through our Research England Development Fund, supporting universities to develop the capability to do policy engagement specifically, one of them based at UCL. So that's part of the mix. But also I think the challenge for policymakers is that there is a diversity. In the UK, there's 150 something universities, many of whom will be doing research that's relevant to any given sustainable development goal, some of which will be conflicting in terms of the advice that it gives. So I think there's a huge job for kind of intermediary organizations to help channel, funnel, and synthesize knowledge. And again, that's something that maybe we, as we think about research evaluation, should be thinking about how we incentivize that sort of activity, as well as incentivizing, top quality research in itself.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. Simon, did you have any comments to add to that? No? Great. Well, I think that will bring our discussion to an end. Thank you so much for that. I personally found that really interesting. I know full well our audience certainly did. Can I ask each of you just to provide some sort of concluding remarks or comments based on this session and the previous session? So Stephen, if I come to you first, if that's okay.
Yes, you can. Although I haven't really formed my considered thoughts about the session. I suppose the thing maybe a takeaway for me, rather than a kind of summary of what we've discussed, are two takeaways, both of which are to do with how we think about impact and its relationship to the SDGs. So I think there's a job for us all to do to make stronger linkages between those two agendas to support our research communities in thinking about their research in that way. And I think I'm particularly struck, having heard the presentation and read the report, about the importance of foregrounding this issue about the SDGs apply to the UK as well, and we need to be thinking about how we deliver them in a UK context, and maybe that is a gap in our research thinking, and something we should focus on. So that's my not very well considered comments, but I've given the other two panelists a bit of time to think about this.
Thanks, Stephen. Saskia, if I could come to you next, please.
Well, I was particularly struck by Stephen's point around synthesis. I think in relation to the UK context, some form of synthesis of the evidence would be really, really valuable. So one thing, when the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act came in, initially they had someone within that grouping in the government to work with universities to start this, and somehow that role got cut. And I think that's a real problem, is that there's now a law where these public bodies have to embed these goals within their institutions, but they've no contact to the evidence base to help them do this in any meaningful way. So I think that would be my take-home message. I think there's a call for some synthesis work around the existing evidence base would be really valuable.
Brilliant, thanks, Saskia. And Simon, if I could come to you, please.
Well, there's nothing left for me to say, is there? No, let me think. So yes, of course, agree with Saskia and Stephen there. I suppose I'd like to kind of revisit the equitable partnerships part of things, notwithstanding the very surprising lack of focus of UK on UK in terms of SDG, which I totally agree with. Surely the biggest part of our role is to help the rest of the world, because again, I'll just use climate change as an example. It's global. So what I really find problematic is the sort of support and help and collaboration which happens between the global north and the global south, and how it's just inequitable for a whole number of reasons. And that's just a systemic issue, which is hampering everything else. So, if you don't have that infrastructure, and I'll use Research Support Office as an example, then we are just slowing things down. So I would, if I was a philanthropic funder, then that's where I would be putting my money.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. We have got a bit of time for some questions from the audience. So I can see one has already come in. So the question is, are there any plans to work with public exam boards to shape curricula around the SDGs? Are any of you aware of any of those plans? Anyone would like to? I can see shaking heads from Stephen and Simon.
Great question, though.
It's a good question, but not my area of expertise.
I know Jane Davidson was looking at it across the university degree programme in Wales, so embedding it within the curriculum, and certainly we're doing it in Bangor. So, but that's all I know, I'm afraid.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just seeing if any other questions are coming in. Please fire them in the chat or the Q&A. I know we've got some coming in from YouTube as well. Bear with me while I just double check.
If you don't find a question soon, I'll have to tell a joke and you'll be sorry.
I'll definitely find a question in that case. I do actually have a question for Saskia, just because I know of your involvement with regards to the SDGs at Bangor. Would you be able to provide some sort of insight or examples into how the SDGs have been used as a framework?
Well, at the minute, they're being used very much in the teaching domain, which unfortunately I sit in the research office, so I've not been involved in those conversations. So there's been a lot of work. We've employed or promoted an assistant pro-vice chancellor for sustainability, and his first remit has been to go out to talk to all of the schools in the institutes and to help them understand how they can, at the front of literally every lecture, indicate the relevance to the framework of their teaching. So that's been the first sort of job of work that we've done. Now, we are going to start tracking our impact, whether it's for impact case studies or not, with alignment to the goals at the front end of that process now, rather than doing it post-ref submission as I've done for this one. I would say we've got a large body of research that's already, it's research and development, so it's in that context. So, they're very much aligned to that. But I'm really interested in this work around, non-traditional countries or DAC nations, should I say? But yeah, no, it's early stages, I would say, in terms of embedding in the research across piece.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Saskia. Another question's come in. This one's for Simon. What would your first steps be in addressing the global north-south divide?
Well, that's an easy one, isn't it? Excellent. There is an interesting development, I think, from Australia, the rather brilliantly named Jerry Eckhart Queenan, probably got the name wrong, who is looking at philanthropic funding, which quite often in the UK, you get funding from the Wellcome Trust, for example, the Wellcome, and it's no overheads, but they do pay some overheads overseas, but those overheads don't tend to be sufficient. And I talked about the problem with the sort of the funding gap. They'll fund current infrastructure, but not future infrastructure. So it's called Pay What It Takes, and I'm really hoping that movement takes off, which means that then funders will pay organizations, universities, or third sector organizations what it takes to do the research, bearing in mind whatever government subsidies there are, because at the moment, if the research is not fully funded, then it is cross-subsidized from, I've heard all sorts of stories, teaching, from the university hospital who charge fees for pay. That doesn't seem to be a sensible way of doing things. And there are some institutions who say, actually, we can't afford to do any more research funded by charities because they don't fund that infrastructural gap. So just solving the global research funding landscape would be where I'd start. And maybe the Global Research Council have something up their pocket, but I doubt it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon.
Can I just chip in on this as well?
Please do, Steve.
I think Simon's rightly raised the question of overheads, which I think is very important. I think one of the things that is also really important is for funders in the global north to take seriously the idea of funding as the primary grant holder on a funded project, global south institutions, so that they are the lead rather than the secondary partner. Because I think, I just think that if you just fund your own national institutions, then you're building in a kind of a bias into the system, or a power disbalance into the system. So I think that would be a really good step for funders to consider. And it's not a straightforward step to consider, but I think it would be worth thinking about.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Stephen. I'm just seeing if any final questions are coming in, but I think that may be all. In that case, we can wrap up just a couple of minutes early. So thanks so much. Bang on time. That's great. A huge thank you to each of you. Really appreciate your time. Really interesting discussion. Some great insights and some key takeaways learned. So we'll wrap it up there, and I'll hand back to my colleague, Bob. Huge thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody, particularly Simon, Saskia, and Stephen. Excellent feedback. And I hope we can look at ways to apply those learnings going forward. So we're going to take a look at a case study, which is, say, to gain a few extra minutes. So now move on to our case study, and let me hand back to Alan, who is, please go ahead whenever you're ready, and we will briefly share the poll from earlier again. Are you there, Alan? Oh, he's just joining. I think that's one of the things of being slightly early means I guess Alan was cutting it to the wire. Let's see. Meanwhile, thank you for your comments. I guess we officially have just over a minute to get back on track. So, and after this next session, there will be a short 15-minute break or so. So there will be a chance to sort of stretch legs, get a coffee, and so on.
Sorry about that, folks. I had a second meeting there and it was the wrong one. So I was in the other room going, oh, I know where everybody is. Sorry.
It's very, very quiet. No, I can assure you there are hundreds of, if not, well, not quite thousands, but there's certainly hundreds of people eagerly waiting for your presentation. So I'll hand over to Alan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great apologies for keeping everybody waiting. I appreciate everyone's time is important. So I'll share my screen and we'll get on. We asked a little question about what authentic authentic impact look like? So I'm just going to go through my slides and then we'll have a kind of review about what we think that might be. Okay, hopefully, is that sharing with everybody?
Not yet.
Oh, that's interesting. It says I'm sharing. Let's try again. Invite, share screen, try again.
Yep, I think something's happening now.
Okay, let's go for it. Okay, good to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Really appreciate that. So we should think about research culture, right? I think that's kind of the overarching thing we need to be doing. And a culture implies a kind of creative enterprise. And the research evaluation frameworks like REF ask us as part of that creative enterprise to create impact, a sort of proof that we're worth investing in one level. So that real impact is in the real world. So what I'm going to be showing you today is a musing on that, an example of some of the real world impact that we do, but also a kind of semi-critical set of contextual ideas around that we might want to debate later. So with our research culture so firmly directed towards reality, part of my work is reflecting on that reality. So my research involves the politics of heritage and the problems around authenticity. And for me, that seemed like a useful starting point to kind of embark on this sort of question of what we talk about with impact. I'm thinking about authentic impact. So hopefully you've all got your own answers to that question. So there's questions of authenticity. So I'll go through a little piece of work that I did that really started exploring that, and it ended up in a book that I did in 2019. So I do architectural conservation, and that's for me a preeminent tool in addressing questions of belonging in the decolonial context. And our built space is the history that we all walk in, and it should not be abstract or filtered by kind of privileged authorship. That's the kind of be all and end all, I guess. So my work is to interpret, reveal, repair, and place ourselves critically within the spaces we inhabit. So research can define the particular or redefine the relationship between things. However, emphasizing the value of the particular does leave gaps between chunks of knowledge, and missing their relational value means potentially leaving meaning slightly stranded. And this is the downside of having a plethora of people with PhDs, is that they're all absolutely expert in little bits. And sometimes it's the connecting pieces, the connecting tissue that actually you really need to worry about. So looking at this word authentic, it's from the Greek authentikos, which oddly means to master, which you wouldn't necessarily expect. It seems to be a little bit more benign than that. And what it means is of undisputed origin and not a copy. So that's a genuine thing, right? So that's most people's idea of what it means. But it also means to be made or done in the traditional or original way, or in a way that faithfully resembles an original. Well, that's a bit odd, isn't it? Because if something resembles something, it isn't it. It's just a facsimile, right? So authenticity is both a material, historic reality, but it's also a convincing contemporary process that creates that facsimile, meaning that a Rembrandt painting is therefore as authentic as a brilliant forgery. Well, that doesn't work, right? No, so we're already on slightly shaky ground here. So perhaps the problem with authenticity is why truth and lies are so conveniently interchangeable these days. So starting exploring this, Ruskin, 1849, in his favorite place on earth, Venice. So here we see a very interesting palazzo. I would draw attention to the washing line. So these days, if you find the same building in Venice, you won't find the washing line, right? It's become a different thing. In a way, it's reverted back to what it was originally meant to be, having gone through this process of being turned into a block of flats and a laundry. So ownership and social production is the context for authenticity. That example shows us that meaning and material is entirely defined by cultural rights and habitual rights. Conserving the container does not guarantee the fate of the content. And so often when we're conserving buildings, we're also gentrifying them, which is a very interesting thing. So we preserve the fabric, but we're not preserving the use or the users in this case. The evaluation of heritage is an evaluation of culture and its circumstances. So looking at material and politics, but effectively the thing and the process through the same lens. So that's why I think conservation is an interesting thing to do. it informs me as I'm a Dean of Research, which are looking at a number of different disciplines. So how do I look at them? I have to look at them through this kind of lens of balancing this idea of thing and process. So an example of how the lens you use shapes what you see is this project that I did. So for example, this is a building that I worked on, Heritage Lottery Fund project, which involved a lot of research into how to make the thing kind of work better. It was lots to do with decay, it was lots to do with junction not working, repairs not working, having failed, and even the original design not working in terms of waterproofing. So there's a lot of work to do on this thing. So it won this John Betjeman Award, which is sponsored by the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, founded by William Morris. I thought, having done the project, I'd find out what he thought about terracotta, because all the enrichments that you see on this building are all made of terracotta and not stone. It's kind of fake, but we already know that this kind of facsimile story is slightly problematic. So reading dear old Morris. Now there is, by the way, another kindred material to brick, and that is the cast called terracotta. Can't abide it, I must say. And he then goes on to say why, no, he wouldn't. So what he has to say is kind of interesting, because he founded an entire movement on conservation, which is more about preservation and not restoration, which is the kind of authentic looking version of old, which we are quite used to these days. And it was kind of interesting. I mean, what he's got to say, after all, these things are not a bit like cast work or molded work at all. They look like a bad imitation of work. So we're getting this kind of word imitation again, but we've already seen that the word authenticity and Rembrandt are already slightly problematic, right? So I pursued this a little bit further. Now, actually, the process of terracotta making is neither molded nor cast. It's actually both. But it does indeed result in an imitation of carving. So there is this question of truth and perception. Now, terracotta was actually used in Mesopotamia, in ancient Egypt. The Greek Minoans and Etruscans used it. It was adopted by the Romans. It was revived in the Italian Renaissance by Palladio. And then Inigo Jones and Kent and Burlington copied Palladio. And that gave a nice expression for a British Empire. So what truth are we looking for? Is the use of terracotta some kind of inauthentic material, or actually is it very authentic? So authenticity is possibly the wrong critique to apply to terracotta, but maybe it's not. So at St Pancras, you can argue that although the ornamentation is not stone, the use of terracotta is entirely in line with its origins in Greek architecture. So Charles Waldstein, one of the things one writes about when you're trying to do research, discovered that they used terracotta as a way of finalizing the marble frieze on the Parthenon. So you can't get much more authentic than this. So what does it tell us about this silly material called terracotta? So here we are, examples from the 1st century AD, the use of clay modeling to create these figures which go on top of the temples, the acroterion. So they were made in terracotta because they were lighter to lift up there. They were cheaper. You could make several of them. You get 2 for the price of 1. All those kind of sort of grubby material reasons why we cut corners these days, and certainly why they cut corners in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries as well. So back to Morris, what's his dislike of terracotta really based on what sort of imitation? Was there something more to it? And this is my point about this lens that we need to apply to various parts of our lives. So Greek sculpture is the culture of perfection. It's a benchmark of naturalism. And it's a way that states manifest themselves, this sense of perfection and the kudos that goes along with it. This identification with ancient Greece is something which quite a number of Eurocentric empires or aspirational empires have adopted in the past, many of which were known to Morris, and some of the later ones he could only have shuddered at. He had a position on this. Meantime, to the cultivated Greek citizen, there seems nothing wrong or burdensome in chattel slavery. The cultivated gentleman of Greece or England is such a precious and finished fruit of civilization, he's worth any amount of suffering, injustice, or brutality in the mass of mankind below him. So clearly, Morris was actually bothered about politics. And it's not surprising, really, because anyone who was extolling the virtues of Greek architecture thought that his beloved Middle Ages was a total lack of civilization. However, the point is that a lot of the associative politics, along with the use of terracotta and the language of Greek architecture, is what you could call corrupt and exploitative capitalism. So artistically and politically, Morris had an issue with terracotta. So that made winning this award kind of really interesting, particularly as he detested it. So the evaluation terracotta shows that what something says isn't actually necessarily what it means. And so what lens is used to evaluate our research? So REF is the measure of authentic research and the impact that it claims, right? We're all very familiar with it from the UK. And I know that REF is being exported globally. So it's in Australia and Hong Kong and various other places, you poor people. Looking at REF, as Ferretti et al. Note, we find that although many respondents in our study feel uncomfortable with the current usage of notions of excellence as indicators of quality of research practices, few alternatives are suggested. So do we agree with Ferretti that REF is the best we can do? We clearly have no alternative yet. Well, the view I take on this at UEL is that REF, TEF and KEF, all these kind of measures, research and teaching and knowledge exchange, are expedient divisions of labour that obscure the fact that higher education is increasingly about a career pipeline aligned to industrial strategy and the compartmentalisation of education into selective bands of achievement wrapped up in the rhetoric of growth. Ooh, that's political, isn't it? And we have to look, where has this current division of labour arrived? What has REF kind of endorsed? So graduate salaries versus non-graduate salaries, they're down from plus 19%, which is what you can expect with a degree, to only plus 11. Now that's not getting so good, is it? And the median graduate salaries are up 6%, but median non-graduate salaries are up 11%. So it pays you, in a way, not to go to university. So what's all this research excellence about? I think we needn't be downhearted. I think what we need to do instead is to look at some authentic alternatives. We need to see research excellence and its public dissemination positioned within teaching, or risk further divisions, further metrics based on metrics, and even more ideological wrapping paper, which obscures what a healthy research culture might become. So onwards with the more positive. Research-led teaching, teaching-led engagement at the University of East London. So my view is that students are not consumers of education. They are participants in creating change, changing their own circumstances and the circumstances of others for the better. So teaching, research and knowledge exchange are mutually beneficial. Why do one when you can do all three at the same time is my view. Addressing the substantial challenges of social equity is intrinsic to our understanding of sustainability. If we fail to be inclusive, it's simply not sustainable. And that students are participants in new opportunities to engage, exchange, and deliver professional consultancy, becoming professionals who create impact while they learn. So I'll give you an example of a series of projects that I have run whilst teaching at UEL, and the kind of integration of exchange and real-world issues that we like to bed within our research across as many programs as we can. All of them, ideally. So what the project does is take students at the beginning of the year, before they've even met each other, and through a series of group projects, create social bonds through collaboration. We have a range of projects that we offer to the students who can then vote. So it's democratic, and they can participate in terms of their own choice and ability. And it gives them an opportunity to pursue particular skills, interests, and challenges that are present in some of these choices we give them. We do risk assessments as intrinsic to the design process and decision-making processes so that they understand the consequences of what they do before they do them. And they understand that kind of risk evaluation isn't some dull thing you tick a box for, but it's actually a creative process. So we engage with clients, we give them budgets and responsibility, duty of care, professional context for teamwork, sharing, scheduling deliverables, and then producing a critical on the outcome, which is curriculum assessed. So the example I'll give you is working with some colleagues who were alumni students of ours, who set up a studio called Studio Bark, dealing with timber and looking at fully sustainable construction. So they wanted to develop a self-build system using kind of boxes that you could use a software program to design a house with, press a button, and all of the bits would arrive on the back of a truck for self-assembly, which is pretty good, really. So we helped them to develop this and to prototype it. We built this prototype building for the Royal Docks Learning and Activity Centre in 2016. As a result of this and other works they did, they were Annual Architects of the Year in 2018, which is just all the better for our students, frankly, to participate in their work. So we helped them build this house in 2018, which was featured on Channel 4 television, Grand Designs. They then went on to have a show at a large sustainability expo called, I forgot what it's called now. But anyway, it's XL EcoBuild, that's right, in 2019. And then later on in 2019, we got involved with them again, with students working to redesign the boxes as protest architecture, which was made available to the Extinction Rebellion event in Trafalgar Square. And here you can see George Monbiot giving a lecture to the crowd on some of our work. So we are really pleased to be able to use the students' inputs to help colleagues develop ideas, to execute usefulness in the world, and to create an impact through that work. So this is both teaching, knowledge exchange, and there's also that element of research and original thinking built in there. So in summary, setting REF aside, what's better for research impact? The curriculum is the venue for innovation. And for me, the more real the task, the deeper the learning. You can build your career as a profession by being professional. Teaching, research, knowledge exchange, consultancy, and creating impact can be simultaneous. And it is for academics and their students, not REF, to determine what a healthy research culture looks like. So there was a little whistle-stop tour, and there's plenty of time for us to discuss.
Okay, thank you, Alan, for that. And this is a really good point to think on for the next 15 minutes or so. I don't know whether we do have any questions now, but I believe we're just slightly ahead of schedule.
Sorry, Rob. Yeah, no, we do have we've got some answers to the authentic impact question. So first off, we had Anonymous comes in with, what does authentic impacts look like to you? So it's
a very good question.
That was a joke. The answer is it means genuine change with demonstrable and measurable proof. So that's the first one we had.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. And I think the proof is in the pudding, more in the eating. And I think in the end, there are issues around the way REF evaluates what it looks at. There are issues to do with moderation. There are issues to do with expectation. There are issues to do with the language which is used to describe certain things. And so it's not as objective as it tries to be. And I think that in the end, is impact about what REF says, or is impact about what we do for others? And I think that in a way that for me, the answer to that really is about what change have you as an academic and your students made to beyond the walls of the academy? And I think that in the end is the thing that gives the students a sense of value. It gives you a sense of value. Frankly, what REF says is, for me, secondary.
Great, thank you, Alan. We had another one from Penny Howarth, who's put into the question answer. In answer to the question, what does authentic impact mean to you? Impact that acknowledges the value of and absorbs the wisdom of indigenous or traditional knowledge systems and integrates them into developing measurable, meaningful, usable, and sustainable results.
I think that's a very good point. I fully agree with it. I think that quite often we are seen as the source of all things, and that means sort of taking our wares out to the world and making everybody feel better. And I think what's really interesting when you put students under supervision, obviously, into different contexts is that they have to respond to that context. They have to listen and they have to learn, and you help them to realize that projects don't sort of land on people's plates, but they're actually, when they're done properly, co-created. And that, certainly for the students that I work with, they're year 4 students, they've already done a degree. They've not really learned what that looks like. So the idea of co-creation is something which is quite missing in the practice of architecture, and it's quite missing in the practice of teaching in university often. And so this idea that you can develop richer and deeper answers when you discuss, share, learn, present, reflect, I think is something which it's quite hard to find. There is some rhetoric around this, but it doesn't really seem to translate into sort of meaningful change in the classroom. And so part of what I'm trying to do at UEL is to get some genuine change into the classroom and into the curriculum, so that this sense of co-creation really underpins what we call new knowledge.
Okay, that's great. And just a question to you then: what's an example of inauthentic impact in your view?
Well, as we've seen, the word authentic is already kind of completely contains within itself its own kind of destruction. So what is inauthentic? Oh, there's another question. I think I've read enough REF impact case studies on various subjects to realize that you can probably talk up many things. And knowing some of the people behind some of those that I've read, that go, did you know they only so and so turned up at that time, but we took enough pictures and so it made it look all right, and they believed us. So I think having to evidence the veracity of impact via a process like REF inevitably makes it inauthentic, because you are writing it for your audience, and in the end, it's the people that gained the benefit from it that got the impact for the ones that kind of matter. And it is, from my experience, inherently difficult to kind of discuss it in those two different ways. So for me, I find the exercise of REF and that definition of impact slightly problematic, because what it does is it treats it like, okay, well, done and dusted, let's move on, we've got our description. And there's a tendency to think that the job's finished because you've kind of captured that thing which is going to do you for your assessment. And in a way, that's not the point. And I think, as I've shown in my example, coming back again and again, working with the same people, getting on a roll and starting to develop something more meaningful is really tangible for the students. So the students themselves are building on the legacy of what the previous students have done. And I find that very rewarding. I know that impact case studies last over 15 years, and but I don't know. I think there's space for a different way of thinking about what success looks like. And I don't think REF has nailed it yet.
Okay, great. Just one more before we head to this brief break. So we've had one from Jean Moulin at Greenwich: authentic impact, where the statement of positive change is made by those who've experienced the positive change for themselves and not anybody else.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I think that's part of setting up projects that run again and again, is that you are able to build up a really interesting dialogue with what worked well and what could be done better. And it's not an abstract thing, which is okay. Often one just has to do a kind of written reflection, or it might have been better if, but actually to then go back again to the same place with the same people to develop those original ideas. It allows you a kind of a different sense of responsibility. So quite often we're doing 2 or 3 projects across 2 or 3 years with a particular client or user group or community group. And that allows us to really build a conversation and really get something done. And I think that's where it does get valuable. And I think being able to listen and reflect on and come back and readdress the comments of the people you're working with and for is really valuable. And I think this idea that academia is working for people is acute to me, because being an architect, you are working for clients and you're working for people and you've got to negotiate stuff. For many other academic disciplines, they don't have that context. And so then it doesn't necessarily occur to them that their work is for somebody else, and it becomes slightly internalized. And you're doing the work, you're pleasing your peers, you're getting it into the journal. So trying to introduce that idea of working for people into disciplines that aren't used to thinking that way is really interesting. And it produces really quite surprising results. And I'm very lucky at UEL because a lot of people in a lot of different disciplines kind of take that on board automatically. And so we've got a kind of a clutch of people thinking in that way, which is really rewarding. But yeah, that's kind of our offer as far as trying to create a much more public sense of impact.
Great. Okay, thank you. I think, Bob, that's I think that's taken us right to time. So thank you everyone for the questions.
Thank you very much for the questions. They were very good ones, and yeah, really nice voices to hear. I really appreciated the points you made.
Yep, so we are bang on schedule again. So thanks for that. If you could maybe put up the interval slide. Here we go. So again, once again, Alan, thanks for that those points you made at the end as well. So we do have a 15-minute break scheduled in the agenda. So please do stay around because there's some exciting sessions to follow. But do feel free to grab a coffee, get involved in the chat, perhaps on the chat channel that we have, or even perhaps take a look at our projects which are on trackimpact.org, where we have 700 projects that have been uploaded onto there by many universities since the beginning of this year across all the SDGs and different impact types. So you may wish to browse through there. We'll also share some insights after the break from our recent in-depth study on the RAE report, which analyzes the research impact across the 350 plus or so impact case studies that were undertaken by the Hong Kong universities. So again, we'll start at about 20 to the hour for those of you in different time zones, which is 3:40 for the people from the UK. See you shortly. Thank you. Okay, we'll be starting in about 20 seconds. Good. Well, welcome back, everybody. We will continue straight on with our second panel discussion. And so I'll now hand over to Vertigo Ventures CEO and founder, Laura Tucker. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. As we're introducing this session and this discussion, I'll just take a minute to introduce ourselves. Our mission is to embed our impact reporting for a sustainable world, as we believe if you can measure it, you can manage it. VV supports research managers and academics through our ecosystem of 5 cloud-based products, empowering organizations to seamlessly capture and report their impact data to meet the growing demand for impact information and showcase how they're making the world a better place. Since our formation over 10 years ago, we have led discussions and initiatives around sustainability and how the higher education sector can contribute to this. To this end, and we heard earlier, how we partnered with Times Higher Education to create the annual Global Impact Rankings, where over 1,500 universities from 100 or so countries participated last year. And in case you're not familiar, it is aligned to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Here we determined an appropriate and a feasible methodology for the global higher education sector to be able to showcase their contributions. We also supported the Climate Challenge Cup at COP26 to enable research projects from around the world to showcase their impact through trackimpact.org. Now, globally, we're all facing unprecedented challenges and uncertainties with the macro issues around us. Yet we're still facing the looming 2030 deadline to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% of 2010 levels, to prevent global temperatures rising above 1.5 degrees C of pre-industrial levels. So this is why we're here, and we're excited to welcome Professor Per Lundqvist, Vice President of Sustainability at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden, and Dr. Rebecca Shirley, the Director of Research, Data and Innovation at the World Resources Institute Africa, to share best practices from their contexts, challenges, and what we can do as a higher education community to progress development. So perhaps, Per, if you'd like to kickstart us off and by introducing yourself.
Yeah, hello everyone. I hope sound quality is sufficient. Laura, is it okay?
Yes, sounds great to me.
So I'm speaking to you from sunny Stockholm, but we are moving into a colder time period. So I share my time between professorship in energy technology, working mostly with issues related to energy efficiency, buildings, and so forth. But then I'm also acting as a vice president for sustainability at KTH. So I'm working very closely with our sustainability office and our sustainability reporting, but also the strategies we are trying to elaborate on continuously at university to improve ourselves. So I'm sharing my time between 2 jobs, basically. So.
Great, thank you so much. And Rebecca?
Thanks, Laura, and thank you so much for inviting me here. Per, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm the Director for Research, Data and Innovation at the World Resources Institute Africa. For those of you that may not be familiar with the World Resources Institute, we are an international nonprofit research institution really focused at the intersection between people, nature, and climate. And we deliver research along a number of different programmatic pillars. So we do a lot of work on food and restoration across the continent. We do a lot of work on cities and urban transitions. We do a lot of work on energy, which is the work that I lead. We also do a lot of work on climate and adaptation. And then, of course, we do work on economic and systems level transitions and governance and so on. So a pleasure to be here. Like Pierre, I wear a couple of hats. I also lecture at Carnegie Mellon University Africa, where I teach integrated energy systems, and I help design a master's in sustainable energy transitions at one of the local universities here in Kenya. So I'm really, really keen on this topic about the relationship between research culture, higher education, and delivering our SDGs. So thanks again for having me.
Great. Thank you for those introductions. Well, let's kick things off. I guess if we, from my perspective, we start at that sort of broad, high level, I guess from both of your perspectives, it'd be really interesting to understand, from what is the current state of the SDG targets from what you're seeing within your contexts?
What do you want? Who do you want to start?
I say, who would like to start?
I mean, we are just finalizing our SDG report that we do now yearly, and so it's very looking like, let's say, inside university is one thing, but when you're looking at the bigger issue, it's really a big question and really difficult. If something, there's a lot to be done on all levels, and I mean, what is very clear for me is that most stakeholders still fail to recognize the systemic nature of the SDGs and how they affect each other, and that's something that we need to balance the social, economic, and environmental sustainability. And it's usually a lot of silver bullet solutions, and we are failing to see the bigger picture. And so I think that's one of the key things that we have to work on. And there are several really good publications coming out where, for instance, the food, energy, water nexus issues are becoming more and more understood and so forth. But it's so that's something. And actually, one thing that I found super interesting today, preparing a little bit, I looked at this Sustainability Development Report 2022 and this excellent interactive dashboard that I really encourage everyone to go in there and explore a little bit more in detail. And I mean, there's so many contradictions for every country. I was totally surprised to see that Sweden was coming out very strongly from a negative point of view in export of hazardous pesticides. I had no idea. So I mean, there's so many things to explore and investigate here, but I think the systemic nature is one of the challenges that we really try to address also with our students and in the research now.
Great. And Rebecca, from your perspective?
Yeah, I'll speak to Africa specifically rather than the global outlook. And the best data or estimates, Laura, that we have on progress across the continent is the Africa Sustainable Development Reports, which are published by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, but in collaboration with the Africa Union Commission, the AFDB, UNDP, and so on. And what they do is bucket the SDGs into these different pillars, so to speak. So rather than running through all 17, you can kind of think about them in these basic clusters of peace, of prosperity, of people, of planets, and so on. So how are we doing as a continent? Well, if we take a look at the people pillar first, which is really the set of SDGs that cover things like poverty, hunger, health, education, and gender, we're not doing so well here. The poverty headcount remains very high generally across the continent, less so in Northern Africa and so on, but still quite high. Roughly 40% of Africans are still living in extreme poverty. In some regions, this number is actually going up rather than going down. Of course, due to the war and what that means for food security and so on, what the pandemic did as well. But in absolute numbers, we're seeing more and more people falling into lives under conditions of extreme poverty. So that's something that we have to be watchful of, and that people pillar really connects very closely to the prosperity pillar, which is where we talk about inclusive and economic growth, affordable access to energy, industry, internet access, and these kinds of things. Doing a bit better here, making a lot of strides on digitization and digital access. We are seeing a doubling of energy access across the continent, but because on average, so in countries on average, but because population growth is so fast, past, those gains are actually wiped out. So in some countries, we're actually seeing a declining percentage rate, even though in absolute numbers, or a declining absolute numbers, even though the percentage rate might be going up. So still a lot of work to do there. The planet pillar, so those are all more the environmental SDGs, thinking about regulations around environmental protection and safeguarding, progressing, but moving very, very slowly on those fronts. And then I think it's suffice to say that on pillars like the peace pillar, we are unlikely to achieve any of the goals around peace, security, governance, whether we're talking about the SDG goals or the Africa Union agenda. Likewise, on partnerships pillar, that's really about, those are the SDGs around financing, and we are not seeing the scaling of finance that we need to deliver any of the SDG goals across the continent. So lots of work to do here. And I think the important question for a community like this is, how research and research culture are implicated in helping to unlock some of the solutions towards faster progress on these goals.
Exactly. And to sort of pick up on that question is on that piece, and maybe it starts off with what you mentioned about partnerships. And I know you're talking in terms of the financial requirements that are still needed and the work to do there. But it would be good to understand what your role is, or what you see the role that higher education can play in progressing the achievement of the SDG targets. And we heard earlier about how we can do more in that area, and actually it has a vital part to play in sort of echoing what you're saying. And so it'd be great to learn a bit more what you see as the key roles and what that higher education can bring towards that.
Sure. Shall I then, you want me to kick off that one?
Yes, go for it.
Great. I want to answer that question, of course, as a good researcher does, with graphics and data. So there's a slide that I sent through. I hope that Alex and the team behind the scenes can bring that slide up. Because I think that to answer your question, Laura, we have to kind of unpack why are we where we are? And then we can talk about, how the research community can be supportive of solutions moving forward. And I want to talk about a challenge, but kind of frame it as a research opportunity. It's a big challenge. And I want to talk about why it's such a unique challenge in the context of Africa. So we're going to walk through these three graphs in a clockwise fashion. Let me just start over here on the left. And one of the challenges for us is just simply the access to funding for research across the continent. And funding is so closely tied to agenda setting. So since the early 2000s, when the international consciousness about climate change really took root, funding for climate research has, of course, shot up, as you can see here very clearly on the graph. And the science is clear that African countries are warming faster than the global average. In fact, as a continent, we've already passed the 1 degree Celsius average temperature marking back in 2015. And in 2020, over 39 African countries had already reported average temperatures over the 1 degree Celsius warmer. So despite facing disproportionately higher risks from climate change, Africa is that red line that you can see here. Despite those disproportionately higher risks, we are representing 4% of research funding over the past 30 years. We are 20% of the world's population, 4% of its research. Not only that, but if we move to the second graph, what we see is that the largest share of this 4% of funding originates from outside of Africa, and the majority of the receivers of this funding are institutions based in Europe and North America. Together, meaning that the research agenda of this 4% is not even being set in Africa. It's not even an African-led research agenda. Perhaps most woefully, though, if we look at graph 3 at the bottom, we see that ironically, it's those countries which we know are highest on the vulnerability index, like Central African countries, like the Congo Basin, like the Sahel countries, that receive the least of this attention, the least of this direct inflow of funding. Now, to be honest, that state of affairs might not be a shock for everyone that's tuning into this call, because Africa is always underrepresented on global funding flows of any kind. But from a researcher point of view, why is this important? Well, we're not only the continent that is seeing and feeling most of the effects from climate change, but it might also become the continent that will unleash the most dramatic climate change knock-on effects for the rest of the world as a whole. Increasing desertification, increasing deforestation, especially in these understudied areas, are projected to cause massive displacement of peoples, of animals, of insects, accelerating the spread of disease and conflict. And I mentioned that 1 degree Celsius marker earlier, and indeed, African economists and our colleagues at the Africa Economic Research Center will tell you that we are finding there's a very direct correlation between those countries that have passed the 1 degree marker and increased migratory conflict across the continent. So I just wanted to share those graphs with you so that you could sort of see where we're starting from and why the conversation about research culture is so important, and that why that bleeds not just throughout African higher education institutions, but institutions abroad, and many of those that might be represented here. We are almost 20%, as I mentioned, of the world's population, home to some of the most climate vulnerable communities on Earth, 4% of research funding, 1% of climate research scientists. So let me just pause there, Laura. Maybe if you want to reflect on any of that, but then I can come back in to say what that really means for higher education institutions.
I think it'd be great to hear from Per, from your perspective, from a Northern European and
Yeah, exactly. I see that we are on the list there on countries. I mean, what I think one of the key things here is that we think now that what we see now in our with our students, especially now, we have a program now. We are just filing applications now for so-called minor field studies for our students, and then we are trying to send out students on a mission to learn, but also to provide and build new bridges and links. And I had a meeting with 2 students today, actually, and we discussed they're going to we have a dialogue with the university in Bangkok around coffee, small coffee plantations, and the students had really used they really obviously they're really using the SDGs and the way they build the whole scene around the impact of their project and the outcomes of it, and how there's local coffee bean production could influence the local society and also the systemic nature of the project and so forth. So and we have really strived to not only, this is not just a research subject, but it's actually basic tools for tomorrow's engineers. And when we discuss our impact, we had a research assessment exercise last summer, and one of the impact reports, a lot of the emphasis is clear that actually the graduating students is a very strong source of potential impact if they have the right toolbox and so forth. So that's one of the things that at least it's a very positive sign that they use it in the way they see problems and they understand it. And another thing we have tried to do also is to we are organized in 5 schools in our university in Stockholm, and one of the schools we did a quite extensive project where we basically forced all the researchers in that school, industrial engineering and management, which has several departments, production engineering, machine design, energy, material science, and industrial economics, so forth. We forced all the researchers in that school, about 1,500 people, to map up all the research projects to the SDGs. And that was also a very interesting exercise, because for some of the researchers, it was very obvious what they were doing, why they were doing it, and they were very clear on it, but they hadn't really thought about the secondary effects of it, or the cannibalism between different other things to do on a budget, let's say, limitation. But for some researchers, it was super difficult to really do it, and it was really good exercise. So bringing the tools to the researchers to actually use this is one of the things that will also speed up, I think. So not only specific research funding, but all research funding could contribute in a sense, because when researchers, and I can elaborate more on that, but what is the big shift now in attitude among researchers? Is it the top-down efforts from the board of the university to do more sustainability is being replaced by a bottom-up initiative that most researchers see the need to contextualize what they do into SDGs and so forth. So it's a big shift in attitude among researchers in how they actually see the world and how they formulate problems. So that's at least something. We also do a couple of collaborations with the African University. We have something called Sustainable Development Hub, where we try to connect, and we have been working jointly on developing master programs and so forth. So I think what we try to do is to connect, but I can see what Rebecca says about where the funding ends up in the long run has a very strong implication also what the researchers see and how they actually aim the project. So, but at least there's a really positive attitude when it comes to problem formulation and seeing the wider problems and not just the traditional way of, let's say, exploring research within the topic but rather from a challenge-driven perspective. So
Yeah,
I think that's a positive sign, at least from especially the younger faculty is much more keen to see the world rather than seeing just their own work, their own desk. So
thank you. And we heard about the linkage and that mapping sort of gap earlier on as well. And actually there's an opportunity to do more, that there's already work going on that the researchers are doing in terms of sustainability in the SDGs, but actually they're not necessarily making that link and mapping it. So I think that's really interesting. And from what you're saying, Rebecca, in terms of what you think that the role could be for higher education, Per, you just touched on about students and I guess research and academics now doing this bottom-up approach. So it'd be great to hear what you're seeing and what you think.
Absolutely. So I think one is, as we've just talked about, the research community in the European Union, in the UK, as Pierre said, thinking a bit more strategically and more broadly around how to encourage partnerships that allow for and in fact require more local partnership, more local agenda setting, more local leadership, and so on. I think that's a huge one. Second is, once we've sort of begun to address that challenge around where the power lies in terms of research agenda setting, there is a huge role for higher education in helping to create the ecosystem that must exist around data and a culture around data. And again, I'm going to speak for the continent here. So as an example, sitting where we sit at WRI, where we develop a number of data platforms on water resilience. We have platforms on tree cover loss and tree cover. We have platforms on restoration opportunity. We have platforms on air quality data. There's like 6 or 7 of them that I could run through. And what we see is that it's one thing to build a data platform, but what data you bring into that platform is really important, and the off-takers of that data are really important. And we don't have really strong cultures on either ends of that equation on the continent. And so higher education institutions have a really important role to play there. One quick example is on air quality. We have very, very sparse air quality data across the continent, though we know anecdotally in our primary cities, in our major cities, local air quality is becoming a major issue. And so we are working with a couple of universities across the continent to deploy sensors for collecting air quality data that we can then feed into a model and train a model with. But if sensors are, if there isn't the right culture and training around how to deploy sensors, how to clean and process that data, then even if you've built the most sophisticated machine learning algorithm, the data that's coming into it won't be of very much use. And so that's one major area that the higher education institutions can play a role in, is helping to build a culture around high quality data collection across the continent, not shipping in sensors and just expecting that people will know how to use them. From my own experience on energy, we were trying to do a couple of years ago a project where we wanted to collect data on appliance level electricity consumption, and it was so hard to find sensors on the market that you need Wi-Fi, you need good access to Wi-Fi, and if you're in rural communities, that's not possible. So you need sensors that have data on board, and that was so hard to find. And so, just even thinking about the way that we design projects, especially where they're donor-led or foreign-led, making sure that we have the right types of technology for deployment locally. And then on the flip side of that, helping end users develop a culture around data. So working directly with local cities, not even just the major cities, but with secondary, tertiary cities. In fact, those are where more of the capacity need is, on how to be off-takers of data that you might have on air quality or on urban forests and so on, and really turn those into policy. And then the third thing I would say is there's an important role for higher education institutions to play on helping to coordinate research. Right now, as we all in this call and listening in would know, we don't really have strong incentives in the academic world towards partnership, towards collaboration, towards sharing of information. You want to get the grant, you want to host the launch, you want to cut the ribbon, right? And so if we could think about how higher education institutions themselves can encourage a more collaborative environment around data and data sharing and coordination of research agendas, even across the think tank and nonprofit research space, that would be huge for helping us to deliver more quickly on the data that we need for the SDGs.
Really interesting. And that sort of takes us into that sort of challenges area about what is working and what's not within this space. Basically, what are the barriers, I guess, to achieving more? And so you touched on that just now about actually there's no the incentives, and this has come up in the past as well. And internationally, we're starting to see a trend where academics are starting to get some recognition for their impact. And you touched on it as well about end users taking up this work. So I guess it'd be great to understand as well, what do you see as the challenges that why aren't there more collaborations or incentives for that kind of working to support this progression? And I guess I'll start with you, Per, from your perspective. What challenges are you seeing, perhaps in the context of getting your work and the work of researchers to be taken up and incorporated into policy, so that sort of dissemination and sort of what we would call impact creation activity, as well as the sort of any barriers to collaboration and further progression that you see?
Yeah. Yesterday we had a very interesting seminar at the Academy for Engineering Sciences in Stockholm, and it was a 4-hour session on climate, and starting with the understanding of the global climate system and how actually the science works. Basically, what are they doing in IPCC and Working Group 1? What's going on? How can they understand this? And there's some skepticism around this, but it seems to me to a very high extent understood, but then also discussing on the impact, and then the trade-off between mitigation of emissions and so forth. And when it comes, and then we had a long discussion on adaptation and what it means and what has to be done in the sense of with the focus on Sweden yesterday and so forth. And then at the we discussed at the end the kind of the ecosystem for innovation and solving and so forth. And at the same time yesterday we had a new government from Sweden. So the first thing they did was to shut down the environmental ministry. So I mean, there's a lot of contradiction in the sense of I mean what we can do at the university being part of the, of course, the debate and so forth, and acting through our different organizations. I spent 5 years in IPCC in Working Group 3, way back in 2000 to 2007, 6, something like that. When we all actually got this Nobel Peace Prize award. So we were really, really, encouraged all the researchers, that we actually got a copy of the diploma, and so they really, acknowledged us. So we were really, that was a really boost where we saw that we had an impact. And I was particularly working on the issue of ozone depletion being replaced by working fluids and so forth that were actually strong climate gases. So solving one problem, jumping into another one in the sense. But so that was a lot of really, when we felt that we actually made a difference in the sense of and that's one of the few things that's actually been declared as a problem under solving with the ozone hole and those things. Anyway, but I think what we can do, we can act in 5 areas where we have agency, let's say at university, and we touched on education. So we have a very strong agenda that all students that go through our university should have a sort of a fundamental level of sustainability competence, not only knowing about the problems and the issues, but also possessing skills to deal with it. So it's a difference between knowing about what is the problem, but also it's another thing to have certain skills and abilities to actually deal with it. So that's other things. What we can do also in the research is trying to initiate new constellations and new partnerships and trying to move more research more into the complex challenges and so forth and work on it. And of course, the third area where we have the possibility to be more active is in the partnerships. And we do partner up with society and industry and so forth, and also internationally in many ways. So it's something but it's also a bit of a challenge to keep that and keep that going, because we easily end up in, there's a lot of networks. There's an abundance of new initiatives and networks around sustainability and so forth. It's difficult to navigate. One network that we quite early engaged in was the International Sustainable Campus Network. If you're familiar with that one, was initiated by ETH and EPFL in Switzerland, and then quite rapidly built a strong network of universities. So, but there are many new initiatives coming, and we struggle with the networking and so forth. So, any advice on that? And we're actually now doing a survey within the university for which networks we are engaged in and who are engaged and what are you doing there. And so we're just trying to and it also causes a lot of travel, and that's something we're also trying to focus on. We need to maintain our contacts with Rebecca and her colleagues in Africa and so forth, but we can't afford to travel there all the time because of not just from the point of view of climate gases and so forth, but also cost and time and so forth. We have to be more efficient and then also, of course, we have our campus operations, using the campus in a more creative way as a living lab for innovation and a place to go to learn, not just as part of the city there. Nobody goes unless you're a student or so. And then we have our ways of working, the working place, the gender equality, diversity, equal conditions, the whole culture of research is also very strongly related to what actually the message we bring out. So we have a lot of areas where we have set up quite detailed goals for these areas, and we also have a climate action goal where we have our sort of climate gas emission reduction scheme set up. So we are really working on it, but it's really a challenge to maintain momentum in all this, especially deciding on the proper partnerships and keeping them alive in the sense that they actually are very productive and so forth. So I'm happy to hear more from Rebecca about how you would suggest we could work more together in north-south kind of axis and so forth, because we are trying, but maybe we are not trying on your premise, or let's say on in a way that you feel productive and so forth. There are much more we can do together, I guess, in ways, in new ways.
So what are the challenges, I guess, perhaps that isn't part for Rebecca to take up from your perspective with collaboration around the topic of sustainability between countries and continents?
Let me answer that, Laura, with what is at least working. I think you've posed a really important question. Why aren't there more incentives for the academic community, for higher education institutions around uptake of our work and outputs? I think that is a huge, almost existential question that research institutions have to ask themselves. So we'll park that one. But let me tell you what we've been trying to do and what we see is working. One is, as I mentioned, investment in data and data platforms is important. Investment in the capacity building around the entire ecosystem is equally as, if not more important. So what we do at WRI is, even as we're developing platforms like, for instance, the Energy Access Explorer, which I mentioned earlier, that provides data on electricity pathways for at the community level, at the household level. What we do is we deliver trainings on how to use those platforms, not at the country level, but at the county level, county by county within country, because these secondary, tertiary cities, as I mentioned before, and urban centers are actually where the need really is. And what that does is that creates agency. It allows for local stakeholders to feel empowered in the use of the tools and the use of the data. And that's, very, very critical for the delivery of SDG 7, which is focused on energy access. Another thing I think that is important is consortium building. And if you build consortiums, part of what you're helping to do is create the demand for your products, for your research. So again, an example here would be what we've done with restoration. So we helped to convene African governments across the entire continent, agreeing to deliver or to restore 100 million hectares of forest lands or degraded forest lands by 2030. That's a tall order, and there's a lot of research that's needed in order to do that well. You have to understand where the restoration opportunities are. You have to understand how tree planting and other ecosystem services go hand in hand. You have to do the monitoring and the evaluation to understand ecosystem restoration. And by creating that consortium, what we've actually done is help to create the demand for offtake of that research and of that information. And so that then creates a plethora of funding opportunities for the research itself. And that's delivering on SDG 15, right? Life on land. So again, that's sort of a way to create the demand for the products that you have and that are of value. And then a third one is around education, which Pierre touched on. Education meaning building academic programs that are more aligned with the needs of communities and building out, importantly, pipelines for recruitment. What we see often here is programs that may be misaligned with the particular demands of a sector. Let's just take energy as an example, and I'll refer to the master's program that we designed with Strathmore University. The reason that we designed that master's is because we realized, hey, in Kenya, there isn't yet a program that is directly addressing the research and analytics needs of the sector. Where are the people to do that analysis going to come from if the programs don't exist to graduate them out of? And so making sure that our programs are really aligned with needs is important, and that there is this pipeline, a ready way of converting graduates into persons that can be employed in the sector. But likewise, even if you're coming from a research institution that's less on the academics, being okay with practical and applied research questions where the research agenda is set by the community. And a quick example I'll give here is an entire body of work that we did around jobs creation. The energy sector was saying, we know anecdotally that we're creating a lot of jobs across the continent, especially in the off-grid space, so off-grid renewables, solar home systems, mini grids, and so on. But we don't really have the data to know if that's true or not. And then that lack of data prevents us from unlocking potential funding opportunities that might come if we had it. Is that a very novel question to ask? No. But is it the need of the community? Yes. And so we took it up and we produced a number of papers through survey techniques, going again country by country. We did Kenya, we did Nigeria, then that survey expanded to 5 countries, producing data that didn't exist before on what the jobs creation estimates from the off-grid space look like. And that had a ricochet effect on the energy sector. It made a lot of donors pay attention to the connection between SDG 7, which is energy access, and SDG 8, which is livelihoods and employment. And a lot of donors to realize, oh, well, if we focus on supporting workforce development for the energy sector, we're going to unlock so many other goals for ourselves. And so those are just a couple of examples of what we're seeing is working, creating consortias, investing in capacity building, and ensuring that our programs are really aligned with local needs. I think those are some of the ways that higher education institutions can be better aligned with delivering the SDGs.
Fantastic. That's great to hear. Thank you for those practical examples. And on Monday this week, the International Science Council launched the call for papers for regional nodes for the African Open Science Platform, with a view to amplifying impact through a commonality of purpose and voice. I think it'd be great to hear how you view and sort of anticipate appetite for this.
I can.
Yes.
I'm just the reaction on Rebecca here. So when in we don't start new programs very often. It's a big discussion every time someone suggests something. So in 2010, which is in our measures, it's fairly recent, but it's not really, but when it comes to new programs, then we started a project in energy environmental engineering, and we've been around for hundreds of years, but still, it took a long time. That was the first program where we started the program design by stating the skills and competences needed in sustainability as a core of the program, rather than the fundamentals, mathematics, physics, those things. So we started instead with the skills and so forth, and then we built the other courses around those skills. So that was kind of an upside down way of looking at the program, because usually you build, okay, they need mathematics, then some physics, and then computer programming, and then you kind of stack it up, and then there's no place for systems thinking, or and you need to really understand communication skills, for instance, is way more important when it comes to actually applying and making things happen. So if you can't explain what you're doing, so I mean, if you're solving problems, that's way more important than you think, and so forth. So that was kind of a really flipping the way we made a program. That was pretty successful, and the very interesting thing that we didn't really understand was that the program now recruits very well, but it also recruits 50-50 gender-wise, and there's not typically what you would expect from engineering programs, because they have been more male dominated in a sense. So and we have done a similar program in mechanical engineering, where we focus more on design principles, and then we have also improved gender balance in so there's a lot to be done by thinking a little bit different, but still keeping the core competences, so you can go on to the master and then eventually become, if you like, a researcher in a PhD. So you can do it, but it's another process. So And now we have decided to go on with all our programs. So that's a huge undertaking now the coming years to really rethink the whole package. But it takes so much time, and we are really slow in negotiating it with the faculty board, and everyone is a bit reluctant to change. But I think this is a good example on you can do it in another way, and you can really achieve really good results. So there are ways to do it, but you have to be very radical in the sense of you developing a program. It's very hard to sneak in sustainability in it. It doesn't work. It has to be the core of it. So and problem solving, and it's not good to only know about problems. You have to give the students a very strong sense that they have the toolbox, so they can actually do things. So that gives them also confidence to go out and do it. So some programs are very much design oriented, where you can actually design systems, but you don't know why. And other programs are very focused on identifying the problems, but they don't know how to solve them. So, I mean, that's something we really have to think differently about educational programs. That's
Thank you.
Yeah, I really agree with all of that Per just said, and that sort of that paradox that you often see in the university setting, where what you need sits on one side of the campus and what I need sits on the other side of the campus, and we're not talking to each other. So I completely agree with all of that. Laura, I think the program that you described, your question was whether there'd be appetite for it, and I do think that it would be quite high. And just in summary, I just feel like without local agenda setting, without stronger culture around data, without coordination and collaboration, research coordination and collaboration across institutions and across North and South as part of the discussion, it will be even more difficult than it has to be to deliver on the SDGs. As a final example, because I know we're short on time, I just want to take the complex exercise of developing metrics and indicators around adaptation. This is a huge need for the continent right now, given that we are one of the most climate vulnerable regions on the planet. But how do we, as Africa, ask what is the adaptation equivalent of 1.5 degrees to stay alive? How do we think through what is the resilience equivalent of zero emissions by 2050 from an Africa perspective? How do we define those goals? How do we account for social, cultural adaptation that must happen? How do we monitor efforts? How do we know when we have arrived? When have we adapted? How will we know when we've arrived? How do we reconcile our local visions and understandings of resilience, of adaptation, of justice and transition with donor-led ideas and definitions if we do not have that local research culture and the support of our partners abroad on that? So that's just another, I just wanted to end with that, just in terms of why, again, the opportunity, I see we're calling it challenge, but I actually see it as an opportunity to accelerate our delivery of the SDGs if we are more concerted in our efforts around developing research culture and coordination and collaboration. And again, that's why I thought that a webinar on this topic was so fresh, because we hardly ever get a chance to talk about these kinds of issues. So thank you so much for that. And I just wanted to end with that that thought.
Wonderful and great concluding thoughts from you, Rebecca. Thank you so much for sharing those. And Per, would you like to share some concluding?
I think what are we on time? So are we wrapping up now, or?
Yes.
Okay. So actually, I can share a reflection where I thought I actually wrote it down. So I'm reading. I mean, this is not new stuff. So I have a book that I read with my student, and it's a book from 1967 by it's a famous book, The Systems Approach by C.W.S. Churchman. And he started this book by listing the problems of the world back in 1967. And then he also pointed to the fact that there were actually technological capability to solve the problem with feeding, sheltering, clothing, providing medical care, education, outlawing warfare, enabling freedom of speech and opinion, and so forth. So we hadn't. So then he goes on in his book, basically points out the SDGs already in his, and then he points out to the question, why don't we do it? That's the kind of the theme. Yes. And then the answer here at page 3 or something like that. These problems are interconnected and overlapping, and we don't know where to start. And the second point was that above all, we are not organized to do it. So it's a matter of organization. And that's why we so urgently and strongly need to get better organized together and to do it. And SDGs targets, there are indicators. We are not organized to go directly to fulfill these, especially not on a global scale. Even the governance of an energy system is not designed to fulfill SDG 7, and it's designed for other reasons. And the stakeholders have different more. So there are always contradictions and sub-optimizations. The only way to come closer is to get better organized in a sense of fulfilling them. So I think I really suggest to check out C.S. Churchman's classic and see that this is not new. We're just idling around, and we need to speed up.
Yes, the pressure's on with the time scale. And thank you for those concluding remarks and for your contributions throughout this session. It's been thoroughly enjoyable from my perspective, hearing your insights. So thank you very much for the openness and the sharing. I will now pass over back to Bob.
I'm just going to quickly interject with one more question that we can answer while we're all here, and hopefully, Per and Becky, you've got a little bit of time. It's I think it can apply to everyone. I think it was aimed at Laura, but I think it's universally applicable. So the question from anonymous attendee is: does one really have to be able to measure something to be able to manage it, or is this need to measure human convenience that we have all learned to live and accept and take for granted? While as humans and what we do, we should probably consider that not everything can be put in numbers.
Oh, okay.
So it's a long one.
I mean, there is a sort of the classic "what's get measured gets done." That's not true, for sure. So, but perhaps having better data. I mean, we see there's a lack of data, you know, in Sweden, in Stockholm, and so forth too. We are struggling, and we have done a very interesting project now at the campus where we have equipped student housing with sensors, where we have in a living laboratory environment, and we found out that the use of hot water differs with a factor of 15 between the students. Now we have the data. Now we can discuss a new business model for how we actually charge them for the rent. So having the data is powerful in a sense, but of course we can also solve problems with qualitative information. It doesn't have to be quantitative all the time, but it's still data in a sense. So Rebecca, now you.
Very brief answer to that. I think it's actually a great question. I love the question, and I think it depends, or as Pierre said, but also what I would add in addition to what he said is if we have very strong, and as researchers we know this, if you have historical data and are able to build a strong theory of change on what relationships are, what the relationships between cause and effect are, or how certain activities, certain actions ripple throughout a universe that you are concerned about, then the data becomes less relevant. So for instance, we know from history across the globe that where commercial and industrial enterprises have access to electricity, they're able, we see communities form around that. We see jobs creation happen. We see so many ripple effects. So we don't need a whole lot of data before we're convinced about the idea that a focus on commercial and industrial energy is important, right? So in that sense, no. But then in order for this uncoordinated, unorganized, as Pierre said, ecosystem of players that are trying to all deliver on the same goals. Do we need data to help manage that process? Yes. We need to know, well, okay, who is delivering finance on commercial and industrial energy, and how is that finance actually unlocking the opportunities, and so on and so forth. And so there is it's sort of a balance. I think your point is well taken, that let's not let the lack of data inhibit action on things, especially things that we know have multiplier effects or co-benefits. But there is data that's really critical to managing the process when you've got so many uncoordinated players acting in a space.
Okay, I think that
Great. Thank you.
that brings us probably to the end of that session. I'd just like to extend my thanks to Per and Rebecca and Laura. That brings an end to the this year's Impact Symposium. From everyone at Vertigo Ventures, we'd like to extend our thanks for joining us today, and especially to our wonderful speakers for giving us such a variety of perspectives. Hopefully you enjoyed the occasion, and we will be sharing the documents raised throughout, as well as the recording in the follow-up communications. On that note, I'd like to wrap things up with the following observations taken from the presenters today. Often the data we see around sustainability progress is anything but encouraging. However, there are still plenty of positive opportunities. We've seen, from the UN SDGs report 2022 and Measuring Up 2.0 report from our keynote speakers, UN Global Compact Network UK and SDSN, that progress towards the sustainable goals is far from where it needs to be. However, we are only halfway to the 2030 target. And as our speakers have shown today, there are all sorts of genuine initiatives and opportunities that the research community can seize to play its vital role in moving the needle. By improving the quality and authenticity of the impact data we collect, we will also be able to better track and guide this progress in a better way. Furthermore, impacts on sustainability are complex, and we need to be careful about how we utilize frameworks for managing and reporting on them. Today, we've also seen different perspectives about the usefulness of certain frameworks, even the SDGs, for tracking and establishing sustainable practices within research cultures. We've also seen a variety of responses around what authentic impact means to different people. Collaborative approaches to understanding, defining, and measuring impact are certainty of importance. Within academia, frameworks such as the REF in the UK continue to lead the way in providing database frameworks for analysing and reporting on impact, and it will be interesting to see how the SDGs at a broad level might be considered in such assessments going forward. We heard from our UK panellists that impact is here to stay. As far as the global appetite for impact continues to develop, well, last year we explored some of the challenges facing the Global South organizations and individuals when it comes to collaboration and maximizing their impact. Earlier this week, the International Science Council posted its call for papers, as we just heard, which aims to position African researchers at the cutting edge of data-intensive science. Given the project's view of amplifying impact, it makes a lot of sense to see so many in the audience from South Africa today, where this project is headquartered. As ever, we encourage you to take a look at some of the projects live on trackimpact.org and see if you can lend a collaborative hand to helping to amplify global impact. So now we'll wrap up. We thank you once again to all our speakers and attendees today. Do check your inbox for follow-up materials such as the RAE report. And if you have any questions, please do use the chat or QA function now, and we will remain online to answer. We hope to see you again soon at the following events. Coming up, we have the Times Higher Education Global Sustainable Development Congress in Glasgow, Scotland at the end of this month, and also at the beginning of November. And later at the ARMA Online conference on the 15th and 16th of November. And finally, the second part of the ARMA conference continuing in person in Newcastle on the 22nd of November. As always, there's more information on our website, vertigoventures.com, so look out for it there. Thank you and goodbye to those of you leaving now. And my personal takeaway was Per's comment, you can't sneak in sustainability, which will stay with me for a long time. So thanks everybody, and please stay on the line. We'll try and answer any questions that you may still have. Thank you.